Let me start off with a few disclaimers. This isn't my story, it's a friend of my grandfather, and it's been a few years since I was told it, so the memory might be a bit hazy. It may not be scary to most people, but I thought I would share it anyway. Also, if there are any mistakes in the story, I apologize. At the time of writing this, I was getting over a concussion. This story happened in upstate New York. My grandfather's friend was hunting with one other person. For privacy reasons, I won't use any names of the people in this story. Anyway, they came across a road and decided to split up, going in opposite directions on the road. He perched himself on a rock and waited till about 4 in the afternoon, but nothing showed. At this time, he decided to meet up with his friend. Right when he got off the rock he was sitting on, he saw something walking in the woods across a clearing not far from him. The thing walked out of the trees, and it had its right side facing him. He didn't know if it was a bear or a person, and he didn't know whether to talk to it or not. He then decided to whistle at it. The thing walked away from him on 2 legs back into the forest. It disappeared from his sight. It then walked back out of the forest, this time facing him. They stared at each other before the thing walked back into the woods again and out of sight. My grandfather's friend walked back down the road away from the thing he saw, where he saw his friend walking up to him. He asked him if he had been down where he saw the creature. He said he never went down that way. To this day, he insists that it wasn't a bear because it would have stumbled on 2 legs, and he swears it wasn't a person because they would have alerted him to their presence. He insists that it was a Bigfoot. This is coming from a second-hand source, so you can judge on whether or not it's true, but I hope to find out what he saw. What I'm about to tell you is very true. I've never told anyone in my life till now. This happened to me back in 2003 at our family farm in Ohio. It was mid-October, and my dad and I were on our way to the farm to deer hunt, as we always did every weekend. We arrived there around 5:45 in the morning. We sat in the truck, talking and joking about who was going to see more deer or shoot the bigger buck like always. At about 5 minutes till 6, we got out and got our gear on and headed towards the woods. As we entered the woods on the left side of the cow pasture, I noticed an odd, eerie feeling, which was normal for me, I guess, as the woods always gave me that feeling, even since I was young. My dad walked me to my tree stand and made sure I got in and situated safely. He told me good luck, as always, and I said I'll be back at noon. He then proceeded to his stand. A few minutes after he left, this overwhelmingly tingle came over my body, as if someone or something was watching me. At this time, it was still dark. I began to look around the surrounding timber, trying to make out silhouettes, but couldn't. I was beginning to become very overwhelmed with that feeling of eyes upon me. A few minutes had passed since I scanned the timber last. I tried once more since my eyes had now adjusted to the dark better. I looked off to my left and then slowly towards my right again, and nothing. I tried to calm myself and mentally say, "It's nothing, you're fine." All of a sudden, I heard crashing coming towards me from the left, and my heart sank as I looked. It was a few deer running for what appeared to be their life. They blew through the woods and didn't stop. I heard them still crashing through the timber. At this time, I was only able to make out silhouettes and outlines of trees. I thought that it was odd, but maybe a coyote or something was after them, and I just shrugged it off. Maybe 5 minutes later, it was still dark, but dawn approached. I then felt the hair on my neck stand up, and that eerie feeling came back upon me. My heart started to pound profusely. I heard the crunching of leaves and loud snaps of sticks from the direction the deer had run from. which was the neighbor's property on the left side of our woods. There were 100 plus acres of switchgrass and hundreds of acres of other woods. I looked up and saw what appeared to be my dad walking towards me. Daylight was starting to break now, but it was still pretty dark inside the woods. I waited for what I thought was my dad, and he got about 20 yards plus from me. I quietly said, "What are you doing, Dad?" No response. It just continued to walk towards me. So I said a little louder, "Dad, what are you doing?" Still no response. I began to say, "Hey, you know you're trespassing, buddy," but no response. As it got to the tree that my deer stand was in, I noticed that it was not my dad. I began to freak out. I looked across the woods to where my dad's tree stand was, and I saw his headlamp climbing up the tree. That's when I looked down and saw this thing standing directly underneath my tree stand, looking dead at me. Whatever it was tall enough to reach up and grab my foot with ease. Mind you, I'm 14 feet up this tree. I began to start crying from fear, and my heart was beating so hard and fast, I thought it was going to explode out of my chest. I let out a wimpy, muffled yell. It just grumbled at me and walked off, following the direction of the deer. I watched it disappear into the timber as the darkness was fading fast. Once it was gone, I was overwhelmed with this god-awful smell of body odor mixed with the smell of death, old hound dog, and trash. As the morning went on, the woods were dead silent. Not a bird, squirrel, or deer, nothing. I've never heard the woods that quiet before, ever. Once I calmed down enough to climb down and out of my tree, I ran to my dad and told him I wanted to leave because I didn't feel well. So we left. This happened to me when I was 15. I'm now 29, and I've never hunted our woods in the morning again. I will not be there after dark to this day, and I still have not told anyone until now. I do not smoke, drink, or do drugs. Never have. I promise this is 100% true story, and the scariest thing that's ever happened. I was staying in a cabin on the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland in the mountains. One day we were snowed in, and when you're snowed in there, you're stuck, basically. Now, there are plenty of bears and deer up there. We kept salt licks, corn, and all kinds of stuff around, not to hunt, but just to feed them. Well, I walked by the back window, which is over the underground garage where we kept the snowmobiles and four-wheelers. I see this big brownish thing in the woods, probably 50 feet from the cabin, just sitting in the snow. I was shocked because I had never really seen a bear there, but I heard the stories about them being around. So I ran to get my mom to show her. As we walked back to the window, the damn thing stood up, and I don't mean like a bear, I mean like a big tall man standing up. It then turned around and walked with a huge stride and basically took off into the woods. We stood there shocked. What the hell was that? My uncle just says, "Oh, that's a Squatch. He's a celebrity around here." I don't know if he was just trying to make us feel better by diffusing the situation with a comedic remark, but after that, I never went to those woods alone again. That's my encounter. There are a series of events in my childhood home, mostly at night. I'll name a few. Once, I was going downstairs at around 1 a.m. Everyone was asleep except me. I woke up for a drink. I went downstairs, opened the fridge, and while I was holding the fridge open, I placed my phone with the flashlight on the table. I felt something grabbing my hand like an actual touch. I looked while I pulled away, and there was nothing there. I got incredibly scared. I was sure that my brain wasn't playing tricks or anything. I was sure. So I ran upstairs and left my phone there. Another incident was when I was much younger, also around 1 a.m. My twin sister and I were up. The door was directly facing the bed, and we were playing on her bed with the lights all out and everyone else asleep. Suddenly, the light goes on, and we see a shadow directly under the door. We thought it was our parents. Then the light goes out, and we take a slight peek with our tablets in our hands, using the flash. There was nothing there, and we didn't hear any sound of anyone leaving or even in the house. We could also hear sounds downstairs quite a bit at night. Our parents never experienced any of this, and when we asked them about it, they never knew anything about who was downstairs. My sister could hear it too. These are the more major incidents. We don't have any signs of them anymore, but I also had quite a few nightmares. I was lying across my bed, wide awake when I heard a low, deep growl from just outside my window. I called out to my mom, Jen, who was in the living room. She informed me via a VoIP app that she had heard the growl as well. While we were talking, I heard a second growl from outside my room, and it was loud enough for me to hear it, even in the living room where my mom was speaking. We decided to move to the same room, the living room, for the rest of the night to ensure our safety. I took a trip up to my sister's place on Roan Mountain in 1989 with my wife. After the first few days of running around and seeing the sights, we spent the day just hanging out at the house. This led to a few cold beverages being consumed and the grill getting fired up that evening. Later that night, around 9 p.m., I went out on the back porch to get another beer. That's when I noticed about half a dozen deer about 100 yards out in the field behind the house. One had a nice rack, and I couldn't quite make out the number of points, so I slipped off the porch and eased over to the corner of the fence, which put me about 60 to 70 yards away from them. As I stood there against the fence, watching the deer, that's when I noticed the moon. When I say I noticed it, I mean I noticed that it was huge and seemed much closer than I'd ever seen it before. I stood there at this fence, watching the deer, or was supposed to be, but I couldn't take my eyes off this big, glowing, yellowish-orange ball of light that seemed to be just out of reach. So, after what I thought was about 20 minutes later, I found out it was more than an hour. I started noticing a tickling sensation on the back of my neck. I shrugged my shoulders and turned my neck a couple of times to shake loose whatever was tickling me, and just then the deer got spooked and bounced away. The noise finally forced me to break my gaze on the moon. That's when I realized that I'd probably been out there long enough. I decided to go back inside. I took one last look and mumbled a wow at the beauty of this little sun-reflecting satellite that orbits our world, and that's when it hit me. I felt the hot breath of a huge creature hit the back of my neck at the same time hearing or feeling the deepest chest rumbling I'd ever heard. I spied onto my right, looking over my shoulder. All I could see was black as far as my peripheral vision would allow. It was a Bigfoot. This all happened in a split second. When I got my head around far enough, I realized that my face was maybe 8 to 10 inches away from this thing's upper abdomen. Looking up, I saw this beast's pectoral muscles stick off its chest about 6 inches, and they were huge. Its chest was every bit 4.5 feet wide. Its shoulders were as big as basketballs, adding another foot or so on each side from shoulder to shoulder. This thing was at least 6 feet wide. I didn't get a good look at its hands or face, but its arms were probably more impressive than its chest and shoulders. Its arms were covered in long dark hair, maybe 4 or 6 inches in length. If I had to guess, this behemoth must have been around 10 feet tall and 700 to 800 pounds. As far as its face went from the angle I was at, all I could make out was a squared-off bearded chin. I couldn't see a nose, eyes, ears, a raised brow ridge, a conical head, nothing. So I couldn't say whether it looked more like a man or an ape. Its arms were more like an ape's, but its chest was more human-like, just a little hairier than most. Now this is where the story starts getting weird. As I mentioned earlier, it all happened in a split second. As I spun around and was in the process of looking up, the creature was going from a bent-over position to standing up straight and taking a step back to my right. As it pulled its left leg over its right, it was like it was slipping through a slit in a green screen. I'm not sure if it was a portal or some sort of interdimensional doorway. All I know is this huge thing vanished within that split second. There was no foul smell associated with this creature. There was a slight musty smell, but it reminded me of the same smell a horse gives off. This is not my personal story. It happened to my husband's friend, though I got a good chill up my spine the first time that I heard it. I haven't met the couple, but my husband is Mr. Pragmatic, and he wouldn't tell this story if it wasn't true. When my husband's friend and his wife decided that they wanted a family, they moved to a house in the middle of nowhere. We're talking the total boondocks. The closest neighbors were over a mile down the road. Forests surrounded them, and to these folks, this was a dream come true. They moved in, nested, and soon their first child was born. There was one nerve-wracking part of their lives, though. The husband occasionally worked a night shift. I want to say that he was a cop, but I may be getting that part wrong. While the wife enjoyed living in the country, the nights alone were a little intimidating. Her anxiety was enhanced by the birth of their kid. She didn't feel that she could adequately defend the baby by herself. The husband tried to ease her mind and bought a gun to keep in a safe in the bedroom. She learned how to use it, which brought her some sense of comfort. One night, when her husband was working, the wife heard a loud rattling sound. Afraid, she grabbed the gun from the safe. She quietly made her way through a hallway and was able to see her son sleeping safely in his bed as the rattling continued at what she then discerned as the back door. As she neared the back door, she saw a man wrestling with the lock on the door under the glow of an outside security light. Here's where the story became especially creepy, at least in my opinion. Though she was cloaked in relative darkness, there must have been enough light shining through the glass door for the man to notice her. He suddenly stopped what he was doing and held eye contact with her. They stood there staring at each other. Then, without breaking eye contact, the man's face transformed into a snarl, and he started trying to break the glass on the door. The wife raised the gun and shot. Glass flew everywhere. The man fell and went into death grips. She was there, alone with his body, until the sheriff's department arrived. When the husband got to the house, the crime scene was still intact. He said that he had never wanted to kick something so much as that intruder's corpse. Just went solo camping recently, and my close-ish neighbors who were RV camping were the absolute worst. They were drunk off their asses day or night, which is fine, but that meant they were extremely loud while thinking no one could hear them. Multiple things were said about me and their other neighbors, including, her black tent means she's a part of BLM. I think she's a N-nut, I'm biracial. Women like her are gonna be the end of us. She's obviously doing drugs. She's obviously a lesbian. Then a bunch of xenophobic shit about the other campers. Half the time they sat there literally just watching me set up, process wood, etc. These dudes then proceeded to drive their truck by my campsite a few times, and once actually came to a full stop and just sat there staring. One of the couples that were part of their camp also got into a bad fight during the day. I have camped a good amount in my life, and they topped the worst people I've been next to. It was honestly bizarre. I ended up staying for 2 days because I was watching for eagles, but the trip was definitely a bummer. Outside of them, most neighbors and trips have been wonderful. So because of work, I had to move out to Kern County in Southern California. Aside from hot weather patterns and dryness here and there, it's generally pretty nice. The house I ended up selecting was out in the pines since the housing costs were cheaper up here. However, I would have been better off spending more on something closer to town. I'm convinced that there is something living up here that is somewhat intelligent. About 2 weeks after moving in, I started having trouble sleeping. I would toss and turn and have horrible nightmares that I would only vaguely remember when I woke up. One night it was particularly bad. I woke up shaking and sweating like a pig, so I decided to wander into the living room and sit up a few minutes. I was still half asleep and a little delirious, but it seemed to me that the room was darker than usual. So I sat down and turned on my TV. About that time, I heard something heavy bolt across my porch, like a man running at full speed. I looked out the window and realized that I could see the moon, when before I could not. Whatever it was had been standing there right in front of the window, blocking the moonlight. Over the next few days, things were relatively stable, except for a few oddities. Things would move from where I had placed them, but not drastically. On one occasion, I found the remains of a dead coyote in my yard, though I'm not entirely positive that it's related. Overall, I wasn't too worried about whatever was causing this, because obviously it hadn't done anything to hurt me, so why would I have to worry? Except the events that happened last night have spurred me to post this story and seek some possible solution to this little issue. I arrived home late last night after spending time performing maintenance on the company server. When I pulled up into the yard, it was deathly quiet, no crickets or anything. I had this feeling like I was being watched. While I can't explain the exact feeling I had with 100% accuracy, I can say it felt like what you would expect to be facing something that wanted to harm you, like a wild animal or something. The problem was I didn't hear or see anything. It was a real physiological sensation that was not quick to leave. I forced myself to sleep that night, but the dreams came back, causing me to toss and turn. There was no way that I was going to walk back into the living room last night, either in the event that whatever it was I saw before is back, watching from outside. I do not look forward to going home tonight. Part 2. I'm writing this update from an internet cafe as I've discovered that I have lost power to my house. It's purely coincidental, of course, and in no way linked to my current situation. I called up the power company and was assured that someone would be up to take a look at it in the morning. After leaving work today, I took a short drive through the mountains to steady my nerves. It worked, but only in part. The forested valleys and rivers are beautiful. Even the deserts hold their own. I was starting to feel alive again, but I couldn't shake the subtle feeling of dread, knowing that I would have to spend another night. Well, anyways, I started home and arrived at the 2-lane road, which ascends into the forested area above where my residence is. There are a few sporadic houses on the way up, including my closest neighbor's house, where I happened to notice a police car and ambulance parked. The subtle dread and apprehension started to make itself more apparent as I passed by. I arrived home and the wind had picked up substantially. It was rustling through the trees and leaves, making it difficult to discern any movement from anything non-elemental. I walked up toward my porch and smack this pine cone comes flinging into the side of my house. I nearly pass out from the surprise, but then hey, it's windy. So I walk in, flip my switch, and nothing. No power. Great, I think. There is no way in hell that I am going to spend the night here without power. I remember reading this article once on the theory of genetic memory and its possible link with phobias. It's the only thing I can think of that would explain the feeling that came next. I heard something moving quickly, something that definitely could not be elemental. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my body became stiff to the point where it was difficult to raise my arms. I could sense something behind me, outside my door, and in my yard somewhere. I didn't want to turn around at all. I just wanted to be as far away from that moment as possible. So I just stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was most likely only 1 or 2 seconds listening. Leaves rustling, twigs and branches blowing against each other. I forced myself to turn around expecting to see some hideous creature standing there smiling at me. It would have been more comforting than just turning around and seeing nothing, which is exactly what I saw. It was like a cruel joke. I made a dash back to my car, jumped in, slammed the door and locked it. Against my better judgment, I decided to drive by my neighbor's house to make sure everything was all right after having seen the ambulance and police there earlier. At least I would be near other people. My neighbor's wife met me at the door and looked distraught. After some conversation, she explained that she walked into the house and discovered her husband laying on the ground knocked out. After the paramedics arrived and he came to, he explained what he remembered. He came home and found that the back door of his house was off its hinges, like someone forced their way in with a crowbar or something. After investigating, he walked in and felt this buzzing in his head and wave of nausea. After that, he remembered getting hit in the head with something and then nothing. Of course, considering current events, this unsettled me greatly. So now I find myself sitting in this internet cafe pondering my next move. I had never heard of dogmen, but I saw one in town run past the floodgates down by the river on my way to the recently opened park that was closed due to floodwaters. It didn't look like a scary werewolf, but more like a weird dog running on 3 legs. Its tail was curled up. I went on a quest to find out what this was because I have never hallucinated and I knew what I had seen. The ones most people are reporting are not exactly like what I saw. However, had it stopped to look at me, I'm sure I would have found him quite a bit more frightening. I am so frightened right now, and it's hard to put these words down. I had to take a quick break. My encounter may seem mild compared to others, but it still physically shakes me to my core. On a hot summer night in August of '92, my mom, dad, 2 of my brothers, and I decided we would get a Papa John's pizza and head to the Dixie Twin Drive-In movie theater. It was our 21st in our payday family ritual. I have another older brother, but he had already moved out. After finishing our pizza and the movies, we headed out. But Daddy decided to take a drive and detoured to another part of town. We ended up on Shiloh Springs Road in Trotwood, Ohio, a suburb of Dayton. As we cruised along, enjoying our late-night ride, I noticed that there were no cars in front of or behind us. It was all of a sudden eerie and dead silent. As Daddy drove up the road a little more, I was looking out of the rear window and heard him say, "What the heck?" I turned around to look out of the front windshield and was in horror, astonished, and paralyzed. There aren't enough terrible words to describe the level of fear we were going through. He slowed to a complete stop. The headlights on our '79 Buick had caught this tall, gray, stringy-haired creature with pointed ears and some kind of muzzle. It had yellow, sort of glowing, piercing eyes that made me feel like an ant. I have never felt so inferior in all my life. The creature crossed the two-lane road and disappeared into the woods in 3 steps, but not before looking through us like it wanted us to die. I felt pure hatred coming from this beast. He was mad at us for looking at him. I keep saying him, but I honestly didn't see genitals. I guess I just felt that it was male. He could have smashed through our car and destroyed our entire family. I've seen my beloved daddy scared twice in his life, and both times it was because he felt his death was coming. May he rest in peace. This thing had a face, not just an animal face. It was like he was smart, he was walking, and he owned us for those few moments. Finally, my mom said, "Ronnie, go," and he sped off. I cried for a few minutes, but after that, something strange happened. It was like all 5 of us were entranced on some kind of autopilot. We went home, went to bed, and totally blacked out the incident, like he put some kind of spell on us. We never even spoke of it again. But after I became a mother and a wife, my husband and I were talking about Bigfoot, and I sat up and my memory snapped. I said, "Brandon, I think I saw Bigfoot," and I told him the story. He quickly corrected me and said, "No, you didn't see Bigfoot, you saw a werewolf." I will never go camping or enter a forest or woods of any kind, nor do I allow my children to. That thing has supernatural powers, and it let us know with its eyes that we were nothing, and it would kill us in a second. This was 26 years ago, and I still am overcome with emotion and fear. I just wanted to share in hopes that it would make me feel better, like maybe a weight would be lifted. I doubt it will, though. Thank you so much to anyone who takes the time to read my experience. Just thought I would report this as a potential dog man hearing, not a sighting. Multiple co-workers of mine in Shelby County, Tennessee medical facility have heard a strange creature screaming and making crystal clear sounds behind the facility. It is well lit, fenced, but there are woods behind and also a river bottom near. 3 separate people have heard the noise. 2 together, 1 at an earlier time last summer. This most recent event happened within the last month. When discussing it, the 3rd person confidently says that they had also heard the noise in the pre-dawn house while getting something from their vehicle and couldn't believe it, so they had never mentioned it to anyone. After hearing the details of what the other 2 heard, the 3rd person confided, "All 3 are medical professionals, have outdoor experience, but cannot identify the creature making the sounds. They describe it as being loud, crystal clear, and even though it was from an obvious distance, the call was loud enough to be heard clearly from within a running car with the defroster blowing. This occurred at twilight, roughly 6 to 7 a.m. Also, since this occurred near shift change, there were several ladies coming into work who obviously heard the noise too and rushed inside the building as observed by the 2 who were leaving. Laugh at me. I really don't care. I don't know what I saw, but it looked like a cross between a guy and a wolf. If you don't believe me, I was on my way home from work. I was maybe 10 minutes away from the house, coming up a big hill. I suddenly got the strangest feeling, so I slowed down, thinking a deer was gonna come out of the woods or something. I just felt like I was being watched or followed. There were no cars in front of me or behind me, so I got to the top of the hill and slammed on my brakes, because as soon as I got to the top of the hill, this huge black, hairy thing came bounding across the road. It was so big that when it ran, its back arched up kind of like a cheetah, but only a lot more than that. I knew that if it would have stood up, it would have been well over 6 feet tall, maybe even taller. I also knew another car's OT because when I hit the brakes, another car turned onto that road and slammed onto their brakes. We both just sat there for a few minutes, which was not really safe considering it, I know, but we were in shock. I truly have no idea what it was that I saw. It was not a dog or a horse. Dogs do not get that big or arch their backs like this thing did when it was running. The arms and legs, whatever it had, were so long it was having to throw them out to the side. Think kind of like a crab walk, just a run. And the appendages it had were just as big as it was. It ran from one side of the woods to the other non-stop, like it was either going after something or running away from something. I honestly have no idea what the holy freaking hell it was that I saw, and I don't care if you laugh at me. I know what I saw. A few years ago, a parent at the school in which I Charlie teach informed me about her coworker who had a possible Bigfoot sighting. Being a Bigfoot skeptic, she was reluctant to tell me. However, in this case, she felt compelled to tell me about her coworker's encounter because she explained to me that he is a highly intelligent, no-nonsense, straightforward man who would never make up such a story. After a year of miscommunication trying to obtain his name and number, I gave up. Fortunately, last week when I spoke to this parent over the phone regarding her son's grades, she mentioned to me that she found his phone number. I immediately called him that evening to set up an interview. We met Dave at his home on October 9th, 2013 at 4:30 p.m. Dave has worked as a registered nurse for 7 years and a chiropractor for 23 years, which will prove very significant in this unique Bigfoot sighting. Dave saw the creature twice within a 2-week period. During the first encounter, he was driving home at 11:30 p.m. As Dave approached his house, only a few houses down on his street, he observed a large animal on all fours run across the road directly in front of his car. It had dark brown, rusty-colored matted hair, a short snout, small pointed ears on the side of its head, and it was much larger than a large dog. The height of its back was as high as a standard kitchen table. The front shoulders were considerably wider than the hips, and it galloped when it ran, bringing the front 2 legs or arms up together at the same time, then the rear 2 legs. It crossed the road very quickly. Needless to say, he thought this creature was very odd, especially when he saw it again a few weeks later, walking on 2 legs. Dave's second encounter occurred at 6:30 a.m., just after sunrise. He was inside his home when he looked out his window and noticed a hairy, bipedal figure estimated at 6'3", with a very unusual gait, walking down his street. He had a clear, close view of the creature as it walked parallel to his home, only about 30 feet from his windows, although the sunrise was on the direct opposite side of the creature. After watching it from his windows, Dave ran outside to continue viewing this peculiar creature. When he doesn't immediately see it, he walked to the street and eventually saw it about 100 feet from his location, walking away from him on all fours. It turned and looked back at Dave, and that's when he realized this was the same creature he witnessed a few weeks earlier that darted in front of his car. It did not have a bulky, muscular build, but instead more of a normal, uniform build for its height. Based on Dave's years of experience in the medical field, he estimated its weight at about 200 pounds. The arms were slightly longer than a human's, and the head was proportionate to its body. The hair was short, maybe only an inch, matted and uniform in length or color throughout. Interesting. Notes. When it was walking upright, it leaned forward. It did not walk heel to toe more on the ball of its feet. The lower legs had a slight backward curve to them. It had a slight bounce to its step. It had a 3-4 inch snout and small pointed ears on the side of its head. The woods by where my father grew up have an old abandoned house or houses, I should say, scattered throughout the woods. I'm from the Hudson Valley. Anyone from that area knows the woods there have old houses, or at least the foundations remaining. Anyway, when my father was younger, he and everyone else basically would climb up this mountain to an abandoned house. He said it had old black and white nudes, but a lot of kids would go up to smoke and hang out, so a lot of the things were just smashed. Part of the trip up the mountain basically involved climbing up a cliff, blanking on proper term, just a flat rock surface that you had to scale. This was also his usual way down, so one night he went up alone and was working his way down. Night was settling in, and as he was lowering himself down the drop-off, he felt an odd presence and glanced upwards towards where he was just standing. Basically, what he saw was a quick glance because whatever it was just made him climb down the mountain and run home. He described it as basically very tall, lumbering above him and covered in hair. It wasn't a bear, at least from the glance he got. Normally, you take things to your parents and tell you if you have some doubt. But after a recent trip to his mother's and her sharing some of his stories that he told, it just made it more believable. There's also that whole, you'll see what you want to see, so who knows? I'm terrified of heavily wooded areas, to be honest. I'm a pretty avid runner. I've been quitting a lot of bad habits, and exercise just does the trick for me. I have a greenway behind my house that I can run or bike on. It's very beautiful, and during the day, plenty of people are there. Well, about a week ago, I ran through the greenway to stop by a friend's house and grab something. By the time I got back onto the greenway, the sun was already starting to set, and the path was getting dark. As I was walking back through the path, I had my flashlight on and kept looking around me. I felt paranoid being alone in the dark. As I was walking, I distinctly remember hearing my grandma's voice call my name from the tree line. It sounded so real and normal that I turned around instantly, only to immediately go cold, realizing that my grandma is deceased. This freaked me out, but I tried my best to somewhat convince myself that I was just hallucinating because I was paranoid. Only about a minute later, I turned around behind me with my flashlight out of fear. That's when I saw it. It looked like a gray blob, pretty much like a human sprinting at me full speed in the pitch black. I screamed like a little scared child, and I don't think I've ever run so fast in my life. When I got home, I tried to laugh it off as me seeing things and being overly anxious. But about a week later, I can't stop thinking about it. It sounded so real. I heard her voice clear as day, and the person chasing me looked so real. I've heard all those stories about skinwalkers, and while I doubt their existence, my experience was so similar to that of skinwalker encounters that I'm seriously questioning myself. So what do you guys think? Is it possible that my brain was just hallucinating out of fear and anxiety? Here's my dogman story. Let me know what you think. Well, let's see. I'll start by saying that I wasn't expecting anything unusual to happen. My partner, Steve, and I attended his friend's annual CB get-together at Grant County Park in Crittenden, Kentucky. It's about 45 minutes away from our home. It was the 1st of October, and the weather was pleasant in the 70s. The park spans 54 acres, offering plenty of space to explore, including a playground area, a baseball diamond with lights, and a basketball court. Additionally, the picnic area features 5 shelter houses, a horse ring with a barn and stadium, and two multi-purpose buildings. I love nature, so the ample space appealed to me, especially when dealing with people. I brought a few joints with me to help with pain and keep me calm. The get-together lasted from noon until whenever, and many people showed up. I brought cupcakes with us, but to my chagrin, I later learned that Steve's friend was diabetic and sugar was a no-go. So, not the best first impression, but oh well, screw it. After grabbing something to eat, I decided to take a walk around since Steve knew most of the people there. Our picnic spot was up front, so I decided to explore the other side while smoking and taking in the surroundings. During my walk, I took pictures here and there with my phone as I enjoy photography. I couldn't help but notice that I was being drawn to the woods behind the baseball diamond, and goosebumps covered my arms instantly. I felt a strong urge to go to that spot, even though I didn't sense any malevolence. It was just incredibly eerie to me that the pull was so strong. I knew something was there. I took out my phone and stopped walking, standing close to a tree that had caught my eye. I took a few pictures there and then started heading back to where everyone was, even though I still felt the strong urge to go to the area that had drawn me. Later that night, when we were back at home, I looked at the pictures I had taken and applied some grayscale effects to them because they looked awesome that way. I noticed that in one of the grayscale pictures of the tree, there was a distinct figure resembling a spirit. You could see it quite clearly. I showed it to Steve, and he thought it was cool, but then asked about something by the bush. That's when I saw it, a pair of eyes staring at me from the area I had been drawn to. I got goosebumps immediately upon seeing it. I initially thought I had captured a hellhound in my photo, but when I finally showed my pictures to my friend Teresa, who was into UFOs, Bigfoot, and the paranormal, I knew she'd be interested. When I told her where I took the pictures, she informed me it wasn't a hellhound but a dogman. As a believer with an open mind who has seen and experienced many things, I thought it was incredibly cool. Teresa, on the other hand, didn't share my enthusiasm and warned me that I was lucky it didn't follow me home. Nevertheless, I didn't feel threatened by it or anything of the sort. Ready is a term that has shown up in many stories about close encounters of the third kind. I am very much on my guard for when this word shows up because I have had an encounter in which the word was spoken to me by a reptilian. In August 1959, my parents and I were traveling to Colorado Springs on a vacation. This was before my 11th birthday on August 19th. For some unknown reason, Dad decided that we would stop and visit Mount Capulan, an extinct volcano in the northeast corner of New Mexico. Mom stayed in the tourist center while Dad and I climbed up the side of the volcano and down into the crater. Then we returned to the center. I had a desperate need to go to the bathroom. As I was walking through the center, I felt myself stop in mid-step. I felt my mind lift out of my body and drop straight through the floor. How deep, I cannot imagine. My drop ended in an arched tunnel deep underground. The tunnel was lighted with orange lights. Standing in front of me was a smallish being or entity that I now know to identify as a reptilian. I would estimate its height at somewhere around 4 feet tall. It was wearing a gray color robe with long sleeves and a hood. The most I could see of its face was intense, oversized dark eyes. In its left hand, number of fingers unclear, but definitely a thumb, it held something that we today would describe as an iPad or the like. In its right hand, it held some kind of stylus. It looked straight at me and with mind-to-mind talk said testily, "What are you doing here? We're not ready for you yet." Then my mind zoomed back up through the ground and back into my head, where I stood in the tourist center. Immediately, I double-timed it to the ladies' room and got relief just in time. Since then, I have lived, wondering when the we that this alien or entity represented would be ready for me. I have had other encounters with UFO-related entities, like the MIB dressed in a black warrant officer uniform, driving a yellow Mini Cooper on the military base near Keflavik, Iceland. He told me, "Go home," and pointed towards the Southwest and North America. Maybe the aliens or entities have visited me, and I don't remember it. Thanks for letting me tell my story. I used to work about 30 miles away from where I live. One night, I had been stuck in heavy traffic coming home. I take Lasix, so after a while, I really had to go to the bathroom. I kept telling myself that I was almost home and tried to hold it until I got there. By the time I got to my exit, I knew I wasn't going to make it to my house, so I pulled up to an area where Fidelity Investments is located and found an area that was isolated. This area is heavily wooded, with walking trails and a lot of game, but it is also in a very populated area. I pulled up a little side drive off one of the main roads. That little drive is about 100 feet long, with only room for one car. It went up in elevation and had bushes on the right side, facing the main road. On the left side, there was a guardrail and a view of the valley below. The area up there is huge and isolated, with several buildings that are all spaced out. The place is dark at night because there are intermittent street lights up there. At night, it's pretty deserted too. A few cars go through that area though, because it's a shortcut people use to go from Taylor Mill over to 3L Highway, where there are stores, restaurants, etc. When you're up there, you're above everything around this area. When I stopped, I got out of my car, waited a moment, and looked around to make sure there were no other cars. It was winter, so the bushes between where I was and the road below me didn't have many leaves on them. Because of that, you could see right through them. I was up on this little rise about 20 or 30 feet above the drive, which was 4 lanes wide. To the left of me was a street light and more woods that went down another hill to the main road. I went to the back of my car and did what I had to do. When I finished, I stood up and all at once, every hair on my body stood up. I knew I wasn't alone. I scanned the area in front of me and must have heard something behind me because I turned around and there were 3 deer standing there, all huddled up together between my car and the guardrail. They weren't looking at me. They were looking across the road. I looked back over there, and that was when I saw a figure standing between the bushes in front of it and the tree line behind it. It was huge. I stand 5'5". Some of those bushes were about 6 feet tall, but they only came up to about the collarbone area on this thing. Due to the street light to the right of it, about 20 feet away, I was able to get a pretty clean outline of this thing. It had a large dog-shaped head and pointed ears. I couldn't make out its neck, but I could make out massive shoulders. That's when it growled. It was a deep vibration I could feel in my chest. My body just took over at that point. I have to explain this part of it to you. I worked security for years in California in the music business. As a woman, I have to really work out and train to defend myself. I kickboxed for 8 years and worked out every day. I also trained dogs, mainly Anatolian Shepherds and German Shepherds. Sometimes I have to establish who is the alpha, and to do that, I get them down, hold them in place, grab them by their ear and growl until they submit. Then the training can start. So when this thing growled at me, it was just pure instinct. I dropped down to a crouching position and growled right back at it. When I did that, it stopped growling and started sniffing the air. Its snout went up, and it turned its head slightly as it was sniffing. It then took a few steps forward. I was still crouched down on all fours and moved forward, still growling at the thing. When I did that, it stopped. I stood up and kept staring right at it. I never broke eye contact with it. Then it slowly stepped back into the tree line until I couldn't make it out as clearly as before and started to move to the right of me. The deer were still behind me. They were so close I could have reached out and touched them. I waved my arms and told them to get out of there. When I did that, they went back over the guardrail and took off down the hill. That's when I jumped in my car and got out of there as fast as I could. I felt this thing was trying to circle behind me, and I wasn't going to wait around for that. Do I think I scared it? No. But I do think I confused it for a couple of minutes, and that gave me time to move. I told my husband about what had happened up there, but I didn't tell him exactly what I saw. He would think I was nuts, and to be honest, I thought I was a little crazy myself until I saw a picture of a dogman. I know there are other things in this world that can't be explained. I've seen them. But this was beyond any of those things. Since this has happened, I can't take that shortcut through that area anymore. My husband took me back over that way once to see the area, and I was begging him to get me out of there the whole time. I thought I was going to throw up. The wildlife up there has almost totally disappeared. I never see anything up on the hills anymore. The street I live on is only about 1 mile or so down the hill from this place, and lately, we have seen coyotes on the streets like they have been chased out, and pets here have started to go missing. We've also seen a large, black figure moving through our backyards down here. The dogs throughout the neighborhood go crazy regularly now, too. People were calling the cops when we saw that large, black figure jumping fences. I'm concerned that it has come down the hill after eating everything up there. Sash Lake, visiting from Wiltshire, reported that at 12:20 p.m. I was leaving Drumnadrochit on a coach, admiring the view while the coach was driving past the loch. It started to rain and a light fog rolled in. My view and vision was partly limited due to the trees alongside the loch, but something caught my eye for approximately 5 seconds and made me jump out of my skin. I saw a huge black mass and hump in the middle of the loch, roughly the size of a double-decker bus. I would say it was around 100 yards away from me. I was confused and in disbelief. I jumped to my feet to get a better look. Trees completely blocked my view for about 5-8 seconds. There was a clearing in the trees, and when I looked back to where I saw the black mass and hump, there was nothing there. Seasons never change high enough above the snow line. In this land of endless forests and shrouds of drifting mist, I've hunted here on my people's traditional land with my father and with the ghosts of my ancestors. Guided and knowing my path, I call myself a man. But to those whose forest this is, I am animal friend. It was a day when the dark green shadow of the mountain held a bridal veil of pure white clouds. Old Raven was calling to me, asking for crumbs for my sandwich. That is the last moment of my life when I was at peace. Many seekers of Skookum come here. They think they will find evidence of Bigfoot while they camp, hide camera traps, and hike a few miles into the ancient forests. I know Skookum, and it takes a lifetime of understanding and growth, not just a 4-day hiking holiday and some amateur knowledge. There is a dark side to Bigfoot searches. Not all of those who track him are without knowledge. There is Silent Owl, a fallen medicine healer whose family died a few years ago during the plague that swept through our homes. His ways have changed. He will not use his magic to heal. The skookum in his eyes has grown cruel and broken. So, when the hunters came and asked me if I was Joseph Pale, I told them I would not help them find Bigfoot, for it was their intention to shoot the legendary beast and become famous. I told them, Bigfoot is not an animal. He is like a man, peaceful and considerate unless you are trespassing and planning to hurt his family. I will not help you, and I'd suggest you turn around. I thought that would be the end of it. They could go into the woods with their rifles, and they would find nothing but the ranger waiting to check their hunting permits. I doubted such men could even find an elk, let alone Bigfoot. They had no skookum, judging by their oversized rifles. I will help you, but not for less than double what you offered, Little Fox. If he has said no, it now costs double. The chilling and calloused voice of Silent Owl spoke from my shadow, where he had walked over from the lodge to see what the hunters wanted from me. Well, all right. The hunter who looked like Matthew McConaughey said. The others whooped with excitement. We're going to go bag ourselves a creature that doesn't even exist. Silent Owl took their money and went with them. I was horrified. The thought of Silent Owl leading them to the sacred lands, set aside for the forest people since the beginning of creation, was appalling and grotesque. I sat for a long time feeling great woe and horror, knowing of the violation that those men planned to commit. My skookum grew weak inside me, and in its place rose up fear. I was truly afraid to do nothing, afraid of what would happen, afraid on behalf of the peaceful and unsuspecting Bigfoot families that Silent Owl had betrayed. I resolved to go and to try and help them, to protect them if necessary. I am not a hunter of men, and the thought of turning my compound bow on a person and silently assassinating him frightened me. I was not sure where such a thought came from, but I could imagine having Silent Owl in my sights and putting an end to their expedition in just one shot. They might shoot back, but I would be long gone. I trembled, afraid of the consequences of murder, but I also realized I must be willing to do anything, or there was no point in going after them. I went home and called my dogs from the woods, Spritzer and Chief. They came to me, wagging their tails, and they sniffed my hands and sensed I was about to go on a big hunt. Spritzer growled he didn't like my fear, but he obeyed me and got into the back of my truck. Chief seemed nervous, following me around while I packed. When I had my backpack ready, I took up my compound bow, a .36 caliber revolver, my hunting knife, and a survival hatchet. I loaded my truck with extra fuel and water and food for my dogs. For a long moment, I sat in the cab in the muddy driveway of my trailer. It was a decision I had to choose to make. I could stop and do nothing, or I could take the warpath. We were soon off the highway and driving up an old dirt logging road, partially overgrown. I stopped at the creek and got out. We hiked the rest of the way up to where the road ends, and there we found the pickup that belonged to Matthew McConaughey and his buddies, and it was empty. They had already set out on foot up into the mountains. They had about 6 miles to hike before they were even at the edge of Bigfoot's territory. I followed them, with fear of what they planned to do and fear of what I planned to do weighing in my mind. Old Raven found me and asked me, "Where are you going?" I ignored the creature and led my dogs. It grows dark in the forest before it is night, and I saw the campfire of Matthew McConaughey's hunting party, and I stopped and set up a cold camp. I fed my dogs and slept little, listening to the darkness and hearing the voices of the men as they bragged loudly. In the morning, I waited until they left. I could have shot an arrow into Silent Owl, but I was too afraid. We came to their camp, and I finished putting out their fire. The dripping pines weren't in danger of burning. but it annoyed me that they had littered and left their campfires smoking. My dogs sniffed everywhere, sensing that we were hunting these men. They looked at me questioningly, and I said, "I don't know either. I know this is strange, but I don't know how to turn back." When we reached the quiet mountain meadow where my grandfather had seen Bigfoot, I realized we were crossing the threshold. There was no turning back. We were entering into another world, an older and more civilized world. In this place, there was a balance between man and nature, and man wanted for nothing. They were hidden here, unseen by the cold and calculating eyes of science. I followed the tracks of the hunters easily, seeing how they blundered through the grass and bushes. The trees shed their dew like a soft rain, and birds who had never seen humans called to each other for the curious gossip of newcomers. I caught up to them and waited some distance away, crouching down and hidden. I thought to myself that if I was going to fire an arrow and put an end to this, that now would be the right time. All I could think about was them shooting back at me, chasing me, hunting me. I was frozen in fear, unable to take action. My dogs were growling softly as they too waited to strike. The hunting party moved on, and I followed them. We began to climb the side of the mountain, and I realized with anxiety that by now, Bigfoot would know we were here. It occurred to me that I didn't need to do anything if Bigfoot was disturbed by the intrusion. Bigfoot had great skookum, and he could fend for himself. I had told myself this, and used it as an excuse to abandon my foolish pursuit of the hunters. Both of my opportunities to fire an arrow and end Silent Owl's betrayal had resulted in me paralyzed by fear. I knew I would do nothing. There was no point in me trying. So I told myself to let Bigfoot defend his own lands and to turn back. That is when things became terrifying. My dogs smelled something in the air they didn't like. Their loyalty to me shattered as I told them to stop and to stay, but they ran away, whimpering in terror. I turned, and soon I could smell Bigfoot like rancid swamp water. The foul wind turned my stomach and drove a primal fear into me like a thorn. I looked up, my eyes watering, and saw a blurry image of one great hand curled around a tree at a monstrous height. The angry eyes, almost human, peered out at me from behind the wood. I shook and stood frozen, looking back at it. There was a low growl from the creature, and then it called out in a voice that was too much like the howl of a man. I fell to my knees and dropped my weapon. I put up my hands, covering my head. I looked down from it, my instincts commanding my movements. I wanted to survive, and I could sense its rage and its hostility. I prayed, my lips murmuring, "Great Spirit, please show me his animal friend. I meant no harm coming here, forgive me. Teach this son of the forest I am not its enemy. Put compassion in its heart." Bigfoot looked at me and heard my frightened whimpering. It stared down on me for a long time, breathing heavily. It belted an enraged roar, but it did not lift me or harm me. I shook with terror, fearing for my life. Then the ground shook as it stomped away and left me there. My legs were shaking as I tried to stand, but my fear had overwhelmed me. I fell down, alone without my dogs, and lay staring up into the lit green canopy. I took a long time, but my skookum gradually built up inside me, and I decided to follow Bigfoot. I knew that if it thought I was an enemy, I would already be dead. On the ridge I saw the hunters. They had found Bigfoot tracks and were following them. The one who looked and sounded exactly like Matthew McConaughey was in the lead. Silent Owl was behind them. He was looking around, sensing that some hidden danger had him in their sights. This time I let my arrow fly. Silent Owl fell from the ridge, and the other hunters did not notice until he had plummeted to his death. I felt sorrow for my actions, but I knew it was just. He had led the hunters to Bigfoot, and in doing so, he had begun the killing that was to follow. Forgive me, brother. May you find peace with your loved ones on the other side. I spoke on behalf of Silent Owl, hoping that he would find forgiveness in death and be reunited with his family. For the hunters, death was not so kind or gentle. They found Bigfoot, or rather, a band of 4 younger male Bigfoot found them. They were in a savage mood, having watched all the females and children of their tribe flee in terror. The older male Bigfoot had gone too, so I called out a warning, hoping they would run for their lives. I'd watched the Bigfoot flee before the hunters could find them, vanishing into the forest from the open mountain meadows below. The hunters looked to my position on the ridge, having heard my warning cry. One of them used his rifle scope to identify me. For a split second, I thought I'd be shot, but they knew nothing of my fault in Silent Owl's death. They never climbed down to his body to see the broken arrow. Then the Bigfoot attacked. Their first assault was a test of the strength of the intruders. They didn't kill any of them, but they left injuries and terror on the faces of the hunters. They fired their rifles at close range, but managed to miss with every shot. When the Bigfoot retreated, the hunters were too terrified to continue, all except Matthew McConaughey. I followed him as he set out alone, deep into Bigfoot territory. He was determined to slay Bigfoot and would not back down from their guerrilla antics. We came to a part of the forest that was very old, and great boulders were all that remained of some primeval mountain. Beneath the boulders were shallow caves. Each cave had the skeletal remains of a Bigfoot. We had entered their burial ground. Every Bigfoot that had ever died was brought to this place for countless generations, going back to the very first day. I shuddered in dread of what the spirits would think of me for entering such a sacred place without rite, without tribute. I took one last candid look at Matthew McConaughey, where he was crouched and handling the skull of Bigfoot. I left him there and went back the way I had come. As I wandered back through the forest, I found the first of the fleeing hunters. Bigfoot had broken his neck. I gasped in horror at the sight, but I left his remains there. I had my own skin to save, and I wasn't out of the woods yet. I found the second hunter dead as well. The Bigfoot had relentlessly pursued them and killed at least 2 of them. I felt dread as I realized the Bigfoot were close, and they were killing every man in sight. Would I be hunted down and brutally slaughtered? I heard gunshots in the distance. I knew the Bigfoot had found the last hunter. I moved on slowly and cautiously. Night was falling, and I felt trepidation at the thought of camping or wandering in the dark. I pressed on, almost to the creek. There I found the last of the hunters. They had torn him to pieces and scattered him all over the place. His rifle was twisted and smashed. I felt sick as the last light was fading. I knelt at the small waterfall and threw up. When I arose, my panic grew to screaming heights as I saw I was surrounded by angry Bigfoot. I knew it was about to be all over. They would descend on me and tear off my arms and bite through my neck. I cowed at the sight of them and again fell to my knees. They were closing in on me when I heard a loud and almost chuckling grunting noise. I looked up and saw the massive old Bigfoot I had first seen. He had come and seen me and was telling the others to let me go. The Bigfoot looked at their leader, and then they backed away from me and left me there, shaking in terror. I fled through the forest, following the creek until I came to the old logging road. I took one look at Matthew McConaughey's abandoned vehicle, and I knew it would stay there and rust. Nobody was coming back from the hunting party. I walked toward my own vehicle, and when I got there, I tossed my backpack into the back. Chief looked up at me and whined. He had hidden there, waiting for my return. I called to Spritzer, but he never came. With my heart heavy at his disappearance, I drove us back to the highway and took us home. That night, I sat with my hands shaking and my nerves frayed. I had survived, but my memories of what I had seen and how terrible it all was would linger in my mind forever. I would never have peace again. As I sat thinking about it, I wondered what had become of my other dog. Chief had come inside, having had enough of the woods. He sat miserable, missing his brother. As we sat staring at his empty place by the fire, I heard barking outside. I opened the door and there he was. Spritzer had traveled all night and somehow found his way home. I was overjoyed and some part of me began to feel hope. I realized the Bigfoot would again know the peace and isolation they needed to survive. They had let me go because they are not monsters and they forgave me. Spritzer's return home was like a sign that in the end, all would be well.
I live near some kind of a large forest, and I used to go on long bike rides alone at night there just to have a moment for myself. The combination of absolute quietness and darkness is really unsettling, especially because even the slightest noise stands out. I took a different trail one time, and few kilometers later there was a fallen tree blocking the path. I lifted my bike over it and kept going. A while later I heard wood cracking and saw not far off from the trail a tree falling. Noped the F out of there. I am FBI Agent Kate, and I have been assigned to investigate a string of disappearances in a remote national park. The disappearances have all occurred in the same area, and the victims have never been found. The locals believe that a cryptid is responsible for the attacks, and it's my job to investigate. I arrived at the park and began my investigation. I spoke to the locals and scoured the woods for any signs of the creature, but nothing came up and I was starting to feel frustrated. One night, as I was walking back to my cabin, I heard a strange noise. It was a low growl, and it seemed to be coming from the woods. I hesitated, unsure of what to do, but I knew I had to investigate. As I walked into the woods, the sounds grew louder. I could hear twigs snapping underfoot, and the growling grew more intense. Suddenly, something lunged at me from the darkness. I didn't even have time to react. I hit the ground hard, and the creature was on top of me. I tried to fight back, but it was too strong. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It had long, razor-sharp claws, and its skin was mottled with green and brown. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and its breath was hot against my face. I tried to reach for my gun, but it was too late. The creature's jaws closed around my neck, and I knew that I was done for. I could feel its teeth sinking into my flesh, and I knew that I had only moments left to live. But then, something strange happened. The creature suddenly recoiled, as if it had been burned. It let out a loud screech and ran off into the woods. I lay there gasping for breath and trying to process what had just happened. I managed to make it back to my cabin, but I was in bad shape. The creature had left deep wounds on my neck, and I knew that I needed medical attention. But more than that, I knew that I had to warn the others. I reported the incident to my superiors, and they sent a team to investigate. They found evidence of the creature, and I was hailed as a hero for surviving the attack. But even as I accepted their praise, I knew that something wasn't right. The woods were full of secrets, and I had just uncovered one of the darkest. On February 6, 2003, myself and two of my friends set out on a 3-day hike that would take us from Cascade Locks at the Herman Creek trailhead up the Pacific Crest Trail and into Wadham Lake. It was a 26.2-mile loop that we knew would take a few days to conquer. It was originally supposed to be a snowshoe trip, but the deepest the snow ever got was about 18 inches. For the month, we could not have asked for better weather. It was very cold, but there was not a cloud in the sky for any of the 3 days we were out. If anyone has ever been up in the area of Benson Plateau, Ruckle Creek, or Wadham Lake in the wintertime, they would also attest to there being nobody up there. We saw not a soul for 3 days, and there was nobody within miles. We reached our campsite the first day just as it got dark on Benson Plateau. The next morning we headed out for our ultimate destination, Wadham Lake. The night before, we decided to empty out as much weight as we could in our packs and take only what we needed, for the faster we could get to the lake, the better we were assured of getting back to camp before dark. We emptied out some food and other various items, left them in our tent, and got our packs down to 35 pounds. We hiked the 5 miles to and around Mount Chinadair and into Wadham Lake. The 3 of us made it back to camp again just as the sun set. At around dusk, the winds on the plateau got very strong. The weather was already cold, about 25 degrees, and obviously the wind didn't help any. I read on NOAA's homepage the next day there were wind gusts from 40-60 miles per hour around where we were camped that night. I'm going to estimate that with the wind chill, it was about 5-10 degrees that night. We were feeling pretty proud of ourselves for reaching our objective that night. We did what we went there to do. It was no picnic, and we were extremely happy that we did it. We knew that the next morning it was all downhill to the trailhead, so we made a nice fire. The wind helped us make a nice fire, even though it made it hard to start. Made some dinner and sat around laughing and talking around the fire, trying to keep warm. At around 9:30, we went into the tent. It was just too cold to stay outside anymore and started playing cards for about a half an hour. We then shut out the light and lay down. My friend, who was on the far right of the tent, farthest from me, was asleep when his head hit the pillow. But myself and my buddy, who was in the middle, sided up for a while to shoot the breeze and tell a few jokes. I was right in the middle of a joke when, all of a sudden, there was what appeared to be a flashlight on the side of the tent farthest from me, the right side. This light was about 2-3 inches in diameter, had about 3-4 radials in it, and had about a 1-4-inch diameter black spot in the middle, much like a mag light at close range. It made a few circles around the tent, lasting about 2-3 seconds, then clicked off. We could not, however, hear it click off because the wind was blowing. Both my buddy and I saw the light, and it was unquestionably a light emitted from a bulb. There is no possible way that the light was created from a rolling log in the fire pit, or the moon showing through the trees, or anything of that sort. This was a round light from a flashlight or something of the sort, as if coming from a krypton bulb. The 2 of us went from talking and laughing to completely silent and 100% still. We whispered very quietly to each other to make sure that both of us just saw what we think we did. Not 3 seconds later, we heard crunching on the ground. Within 10 seconds of that, our fire went from being a warm orange glow and flickered almost completely out. The previous night we had snow in the tree above our tent and the fire pit. It had melted off through the day, and where our camp was, you could walk just 100 yards to the south and you would have been at the snow line. The ground around our camp was very hard, and it was covered in a sheet of ice. So we left the fire going moderately, hoping that the next morning we would still have some warm coals to warm up with. In a matter of 2 seconds, our fire went from a steady orange glow, flickered a few times, and then went to a very weak reddish or orange glow. 5 minutes later, it was out and completely dark. My friend and I were, needless to say, very freaked out by the events that were taking place. We shook the 3rd member of our party awake, and we realized that we had left a camp shovel and a hatchet outside of the tent. We called out to see if anyone was out there, thinking maybe it was a lost hiker or a forest ranger who was out patrolling the area for some odd reason. But nobody called back. We sat there and listened, and again heard pacing and footsteps outside of our tent. This was not a pitter-patter of a 4-legged animal or the pacing of a cougar or a bear. There was no sniffing, no sound other than pacing. And what's more, it was definitely a two-legged something that was doing this pacing. The sound it made was a continuous crunch, crunch, like a two-legged being walking on an icy ground. We decided that we should go outside without flashlights and see what was going on, and what was more, to get our hatchet and camp shovel back. My friend on the far right grabbed his flare gun, the only weapon we had inside the tent, and we all threw on our thermal boots and pants and went outside in a hurry. We looked all around the tent, shining lights everywhere, but saw nothing. No tracks, no nothing. The ground was very hard, densely packed dirt and ice atop of it. With our packs on, each of us weighed over 220 pounds, and we did not make a single track up there. We were jumping up and down the next morning to see if we could make tracks or imprints, but we could not. Also, we were on a plateau that was dense with trees. There were trees everywhere, plenty of places for something to hide. At this time, I was thinking that some psychopath was on the loose or somebody was fooling with us. But then I started to put two and two together. There we were, literally in the middle of nowhere, 5,200 feet up, 9 miles away from any sort of civilization. May as well have been 100, and the only two ways up to where we were was a steep 7-hour hike up Eagle Creek Trail or a steeper 8.5-hour hike PCT. We were in our thermal underwear, wool socks, thermal snow boots, waterproof insulated snow pants, undershirts, long sleeve overshirts, and insulated North Face ski jackets, and we were freezing cold. There was no way, it was impossible, for any human being to survive up there that night without fire and or shelter. It just was not possible. If it just would have been a case of footsteps for a few seconds, a flashlight, and a fire that was put out, I might agree that there were some other hikers up there who just wanted to have a good time and mess with us. But after we went back into the tent, we heard the footsteps again. This time they went from near the fire pit and walked over to the tent, past where our feet were pointed, and went over to my side of the tent. There, whatever it was, paced and paced for about an hour and a half. This threw out any notion in my head that it was a human being. It just was not physically possible for a person to be up there and live without shelter for this period of time. I myself am a cold weather fanatic. I love cold weather. But I was never so cold as I was on that trip on that night. It was extremely cold and windy out. There was never any sniffing or any other clanging around of objects you would hear from any animal. Plus, whatever it was, we scared it off twice and it came back. What kind of animal gets scared off or runs off and continuously comes back only to get closer? What is also more, obviously, is what kind of animal has a flashlight? I have had to tell myself, yeah, but Bigfoot doesn't have a flashlight, but then I think, well, we really don't know how intelligent they are. If a monkey can fly into space. When we got back into our sleeping bags, my friend who was sleeping, the one that did not see the light, tried to convince himself it was just some animal for the sake of being able to sleep. The next day he admitted that he knew that whatever it was had 2 legs. My other friend and I agreed to try and stay awake for as long as we could, maybe take turns on a watch. It had been such a long trip and such a physically demanding one. This was hard to do no matter how scared we were. After my one buddy dozed off, my other friend that had agreed to stay awake with me dozed off and both started to snore. The pacing continued for nearly 45 minutes, not more than 7 feet from the tent, and there was nothing else. No sounds, no calls, no grunts, nothing. It was very strange feeling, but I almost felt like whatever it was waiting for me to sleep. Even though I made no sound at all, it felt like something knew I was awake and was waiting for me to sleep. I decided to rip off a few fake snores to see what would happen, just out of curiosity. After my 3rd snore, the flashlight appeared again on the right side of the tent. Again, it made 3 or 4 circles. I woke up my friend, who was next to me, hastily. As soon as I did so, the light went off, and the walking outside of the tent stopped. This time I got a really good look at the light, as there was no orange glow from the fire outside the tent. It was completely pitch black dark outside, and this light came from literally nowhere. We awoke my other friend, and we all talked and agreed that it had not yet messed with the tent. It hadn't moved it or anything, and was not threatening us yet. Plus, none of us knew if we really wanted to rush outside this time. We all knew that somehow this time, whatever it was, would not run away, and we may then be in a world of hurt. So we laid there in our tent for a while, trying to stay awake, but unable to. After about 10-15 more minutes, the pacing ceased, and all there was the wind. I tried to stay awake to see if whatever it was would come back, but I could not. When we awoke the next morning, the only thing that was disturbed was the fire. It was slightly wet, like someone had thrown snow on it, and it also had a mixture of ash and dirt on top of it. Again, all the snow in the tree had melted and fallen off by the second day, so there is no way the snow came from the tree. Otherwise, no tracks, nothing molested or disturbed, no nothing. There was no smell or odor at any time during our occurrence or anything else. We quickly picked up camp that cold morning and headed back down quickly and safely. I have no idea if what this was Bigfoot. I really do not know for sure if this was Sasquatch or some other phenomena. I do know this. It definitely had 2 legs, and it was not a human. I guess I am just looking for some insight, some sort of feedback on what this may have been. So far, Bigfoot has been my best guess. Something else unusual that I did not even think of until about 3 weeks after the trip. On our way back to camp from Wettam Lake, about 2 miles past Mount Chinadair, we all 3 heard a starnge call that sounded like a cross between a moose and an elk. I thought it was just me, but then not 2 seconds later, my friend, who is from Colorado, said they don't have moose in Oregon, do they? I asked him if he heard it too, and they both said they thought they heard what sounded like a moose or a cross between a moose and an elk. It was a low-pitched but very powerful cooing noise, probably coming from a ways off. We were pretty high up, and it was really cold out there and snowy where we were when we heard it. Maybe it was just an elk. I'm not sure, but it just seemed strange for an elk to be out and about at that time and place. Any insight on this from anyone would be appreciated. I do also know that there have been a few sightings around this area from Herman Creek to Ruckle Creek, and any info would be useful. It is difficult to talk about sometimes, and I try not to think about what it was or may have been when I am alone. I would like to come to some sort of conclusion on this so I can put it to rest. During high school, I spent a year in southern Japan as a foreign exchange student. My host family lived in a pretty rural area. I liked to go for walks in the woods, but most of the time my family wouldn't come with. Everybody is really scared of ghosts, and apparently the mountains are all haunted. Once, when I was walking with another exchange student, we saw an old man in the middle of a grove heading down the hill towards me. He was dressed like a farmer, but in old traditional style clothes, which was not terribly unusual in that area, and had a sickle over one shoulder. The weird thing was, when we greeted him, he didn't seem to notice. He didn't loom up at all and just kept going. We joked about him being a ghost, but he probably was just an ancient farmer who didn't give 2 shits.
As a park ranger at Mount Rainier National Park, I have spent countless hours exploring the vast expanse of forests, meadows, and glaciers that make up this majestic landscape. Towering over everything is the imposing Mount Rainier, its snow-capped peak visible for miles around. It is a place of great natural beauty, but also of danger and mystery. One night I received a call on my radio from a lost camper. He was disoriented and couldn't find his way back to his campsite. I set out to help him, my flashlight guiding me through the darkness. But as I got closer to his location, I began to feel a sense of unease. The woods were unnaturally quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. When I finally found the camper, he was sitting in a small clearing, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. I asked him what was wrong, but he didn't answer. I followed his gaze and saw a figure in the darkness, just beyond the tree line. It was tall and thin, with unnaturally long limbs and a distorted face. It moved with an unnatural grace, and I knew that this was no ordinary creature. I grabbed the camper and tried to run, but the creature was faster. It pursued us through the woods, its elongated fingers reaching out to grab us. We stumbled and fell, but somehow managed to stay one step ahead of it. Finally, we reached the safety of my ranger station, but the memory of that night still haunts me. I know that something sinister lurks in the woods of Mount Rainier National Park, and I fear that one day it will come for me again. My family and I were recently on a trip in Glasgow. We stayed in this fantastic hotel that had obviously been around a while. Lots of plaques and photos of famous people who had stayed, etc. The first night, I woke up, though not abruptly really, to what I can only describe as a presence. I heard distinctly, and by that, I mean somehow the words entered my brain, but it wasn't quite a voice per se, someone say, "I'm watching you." But it wasn't scary at all somehow. It was absolutely matter of fact. I don't have any other experiences like this, and I've always thought of myself as a big scaredy cat, so I have no idea how I fell back to sleep. Not only that, I woke up the next day feeling great and didn't even remember to tell anyone. The morning following the next night, my mom, who was sharing the room with me, says at breakfast, "You all aren't going to believe me, but I swear someone was in our room last night." I remember thinking, just be still and let them finish whatever they're doing. Needless to say, this jogged my memory, and I relayed my experience. The fact that we had two independent experiences in the same room kind of confirms for me that something is in that hotel. I asked the staff right before we left, and they kind of smiled and said, "Not sure, but you're not the first to mention this." Maybe 5 years ago. One night, I was at a friend's house out in the country in Vesper, Y, when my friend's car turned in and came rushing up the driveway. The car came to a halt, and two of my other friends jumped out. They explained that they had seen something they just couldn't describe. I asked them if they got a good look at whatever had them so shook up. They looked at each other and said yes. They said they were driving through the country on their way to join us and were driving past a farm when they noticed something in the ditch. The friend who was driving said he flashed his brights to get a better look, and whatever it was raised up and ran across the road on all fours. It looked like it could walk on two legs if it wanted to, they both said. They also said it looked like it was half dog, half man, or maybe half dog and half monkey. They couldn't explain how the creature looked any better than that. They just kept trying to compare it to other animals. They said they were about 20 yards from it, the brights were on, and they got a good look at it. Well, that's the story. I'll never forget how stricken their faces were with panic and fear. I don't think they were lying. A close friend of mine, who I trust is telling the truth, recently shared a story with me. I'm a huge skeptic of anything supernatural, but I can't come up with a logical explanation for this one, and I'm wondering what you all make of it. A long while back, he was in a car crash. He was not inebriated at the time, and he was the only person in the car. After the crash, he was able to unbuckle the seatbelt and get himself out of the car. He immediately went to medical services to get checked out. They got ready to do an x-ray, and when he removed his shirt, he had 2 bruises in the clear shape of hands. One was on his left shoulder, the other on his right hip. The way they were positioned, it's as if someone grabbed him hard from behind and pulled him into the seat. The marks were so visible that the doctor examining him immediately asked if there was someone else in the car with him, because he was convinced they were made by someone grabbing him from behind. At the time, my friend was very religious and explained it as a religious miracle, saving him in that crash. Since then, he's been disillusioned from the church, but still cites this as one of his primary pieces of evidence that something supernatural could be out there. But he has an open mind. I got his permission to post this, and he's curious what you have to offer as a possible explanation. Any ideas? My husband and I frequent the local weekly farmers market. We generally start up at the top building so he can run to use the bathroom. I stand patiently outside and wait. I am an anxious and empathetic person, so I try to just keep to myself as I wait. So I'm just standing there, probably staring at the floor or something, and this guy comes out of the bathroom and just stands beside me. Okay, whatever. I look up, and he looks at me and says, "Going to be a full moon tonight." Said something else about luck, and I just kinda stood there looking at him. Husband comes out of the bathroom and we head off. A short while later, this man and another man walk by. The man who spoke to me earlier looked my way, said something to the other guy I couldn't catch, then said I'd know her anywhere. Okay, next up, I travel a lot, and we like to visit odd places. We stopped at this radio place. An older woman walked people through. Her husband had collected them and had passed away. There was a smaller shed building and then a garage. I had gone in the shed just a moment, then left my husband to go back to the truck. After a short while, him and the woman came out of the shed. She walked over to me with hands cupped, kinda shyly, and said she had a gift for me. I said, "Oh yeah, a gift," and put my hands out in front of her where she placed a beaded Christmas spider. She didn't really say much, other than there's info online about them. I got out of the truck to follow them along in the garage. I had the gift in my hand. I swear when I walked through that garage, I felt all these tiny little spiderweb threads tickling my legs and arms. I was brushing at my leg as though to well brush it away. No one else seemed to notice. Even after going back outside, I had mentioned it to my husband. He brushed me off like I did the webs. This incident occurred in Memphis, Tennessee. I started my career as a Memphis police officer a few years previously in the 1980s. I was on a special assignment at the time. It was 2 a.m., and it was a clear summer night, but quite humid. I was in my personal vehicle with the top down and the radio playing. I was still in my uniform, including my bulletproof vest and a gun belt with all the regular equipment attached to it. I was heading south on Covington Pike at a good rate of speed and was the only one on the road. This part of the road connects the Raleigh-Bartlett area to the Berkeley area. The road is slightly elevated as the surrounding area is low, and running through it is the Wolf River, which is a few miles from here and connects to the Mississippi River. This area is commonly referred to by the locals as the Wolf River Bottoms these days. As I was driving in my peripheral vision over to my right, just outside my headlight beams, I noticed something was moving fast directly toward the front of my car. I immediately slammed on the brakes, thinking that a deer was running across the road. But I couldn't have been more wrong. It came to a screeching halt right in the middle of the road, right in front of my headlights, not more than 7 feet from my bumper, as we both froze in place, staring at each other for several seconds. It appeared to be 3 to 4 feet tall, but was also crouched. It could have been closer to 5 if it stood straight up, but I got the impression that its current body posture was its normal way of standing. It had a large head, at least compared to its skinny, slender body. It appeared to be dark gray and greenish in color, similar to the color of an alligator, but the appearance of its skin looked like a similar texture to a human's. It had dark, large oval eyes on each side of the upper part of its face, running slanted from the top portion of its head to about the midsection of its head. It was kind of pointing inward to where you would expect a nose to be. However, from what I could tell, there was no distinct nose. At least none like a human. Below the eyes was a very thin, dark, almost black line, which I assumed was its mouth. It ran from about the same location a human's mouth would be. However, the line ran straight across the lower face and front, and then turned upward and slightly back on the head. It had no ears that could see. Its body and chest area were rounded like a human, but vastly smaller, almost like a child's. Its arms appeared to be longer and somewhat disproportionate to its body, and they were skinny and had an insect-type look to them. I could make out hands, but they were also completely folded at the wrist joint. The legs were long because even with this thing's shortness, I could make out the top of them even with it so close to the bumper, which was obscuring the bottom half somewhat. They were like the arms, thin and insect-like, but appeared to be jointed. I did notice its chest area moving slightly, like it was breathing, but it seemed slow and steady. I never noticed anything like genitalia. There was no hair any place that I could see, and I'm not even sure if it was wearing any type of clothing. If it was, it would have had to be skin-tight. I never noticed a tail at any point. My adrenaline was pumping, and it was only a brief period of observation. It again took off like a shot, and it was out of my headlights. I could still make out its outline in the darkness, and it was moving like a sprinter. It leaped over the guardrail onto the other side of the road and down the embankment. I will admit that this was not the only bizarre incident that I had during my career, but it definitely was the strangest. I never told anyone on the force about the encounter. In fact, I only mentioned it to a close friend during these many years. I can only identify it as a lizard man or an unknown humanoid. I would have never believed it unless I actually witnessed it. This happened to me when I was 10 or 11. I'm just about to turn 20 now, but I'll never forget what happened that day. I was at my grandparents' house, who were watching me for the day. They live out in a mixture of farmland and woods in rural Wisconsin. Their yard is mostly surrounded by farmland, but to the right side of the yard is a couple acres of woods and a swamp. It was a really hot, muggy morning in July. I was standing out on the deck, shooting at some cans with my BB gun. All of a sudden, I got the sense something was wrong. It felt like I was being watched. I started scanning the tree line and down at the edge of the trees. About 60 yards away by the swamp woods was this thing, standing, that I can only describe as a dogman. It was about 7 feet tall, covered with shaggy gray hair, had the classic dogman face, long snout, pointed ears on top of head, yellow eyes, and it was very muscular. It was standing on 2 legs, but it appeared to be sort of leaning up against a tree. We locked eyes, and while it was probably only 10 seconds, it felt like hours. It sounds silly, but I felt the thing had a sinister grin on its face. It was extremely intimidating. I know that had that thing wanted to kill me, it easily could have done that. I could relive this encounter at my age now with a shotgun instead of a bobby gun, and I'd still be just as terrified as I was then. It definitely had airy negative and sinister vibe to it. After locking eyes with the thing, it just bolted off on two legs through some of the swamp and emerged farther down the tree line, and then ran off into the forest. At first, I thought it might have been one of my older cousins, playing a joke on me who lived nearby. But then I realized there was no way they could be wearing a suit, be 7 feet tall, and clear the swamp as fast as that thing did. I wasn't gonna tell Grandma and Grandpa I saw a werewolf down by the swamp. They'd never believe me. So I just kept my mouth shut and tried to carry on with my day there. Well, later that afternoon, I was talking to my aunt, and she brought up the fact that she had heard strange noises the night before. When I asked what they sounded like, she said it was a lot of snarling and growling, and it kind of sounded like an animal being attacked. Today, me and my mom went to my mom's friend's cottage in a remote area to bury her pet bearded dragon that was stored in her freezer for like 3 months. She was a beloved pet, and she had wanted to bury her earlier, but her brother wanted to dig the hole, so she had to wait because he lives in another province and he owns the property. While her brother was digging, he actually claims to have found the foundation of the first house in the area, where the whole family died in a fire. My mom and her friend, were kind of scared that was bad juju or something, but did it anyways. Previously, her brother found artifacts like coins from the 18th century and children's bones, according to him. I believe him on the coins, but I'm skeptical about children's bones. Is it bad juju to bury a pet in a place that could be haunted? I didn't feel or see any haunted stuff while there or have anything bad happen to me. We read the Rainbow Bridge and told her we would meet her again one day. I felt like she was at peace or in a better place. She died at age 14 and didn't want to eat or drink any more near the end. I burned sage the whole time, and it burned so hot we had to put it in the fire pit. I saw something in the fire pit that looked like a cross between a cacomissal with a lemur's face. Its body was kind of cat-like. It was striped but smoke-colored, like the sage smoke. But then it suddenly disappeared. It seemed obviously spectral to me. It didn't seem like a bad or ominous spirit. What could it have meant, if it had a meaning? It was July 2004. 3 of my friends and I were out in a field, just having a good time messing around. I look up and he looks at me and says, "Going to be a full moon tonight," said something else about luck, and I just kind of stood there looking at him. Husband comes out of the bathroom, and we head off. We didn't think too much of it. A little while later, we kept hearing the noises getting louder. We could also hear trees breaking and things like that. We tried to ignore it, but we soon found out that ignoring those sounds was a bad idea. We saw a creature that was 7 to 8 feet tall coming toward us. The creature stood like a human and acted as a human would, but it looked like a dog or a wolf. We were completely surprised. We had no idea what was going on. We ran back to our cars as fast as we could and drove away. So, I know this is gonna sound weird and ridiculous, but the craziest thing happened at Walmart today that kind of freaked me out for a while. So me and my girlfriend go to Walmart pretty frequently. It's cheap, and sometimes they have really cool Disney and anime shirts and stuff that we like, and it's only 5 minutes from our house. So she told me she was gonna check the women's clothes to see if they have any biker shorts, while I was gonna go to the men's section to see if they had any new anime or Disney shirts. We decided I would just meet back with her since the registers are right in front of the women's clothes, and then we would go. When I was done checking the men's stuff, I see my girlfriend walking towards the food section, and in my head I was wondering why she was going there. So I started following her to catch up to her, and I see her suddenly turn left. So I ran and turned left, and no one was there. It was an empty aisle, and I was kinda confused, so I ran some more looking for her, thinking she was messing with me, and maybe went to the next aisle, and legit, there wasn't anybody near there, and I was confused on where she would have gone. So I decided to just call her up, and I said, "Hey, where are you, and why did you go to the food aisle?" I told you I'd meet back up with you in the women's clothes, and she said, "I am in the women's clothes. I've been in the same spot." Immediately I said, "I just saw you walk here," referring to the section I'm at, and she was really confused. I ran towards the women's section and found her and told her what happened and what I saw, and she said maybe I mistook someone else for her, but my girlfriend is a pretty distinct girl. She's 5'9" and has really long blonde hair and is decked out completely in Disney. She was definitely weirded out, but kind of just shrugged it off, but honestly, I have no clue what happened. I was only like 7 feet from her when she turned the aisle, and I don't think she would have made it all the way down to the next aisle by the time I turned into it. And I ran around the entire vicinity looking for her because I thought it was weird. She was legit trying on clothes when I met back up with her at the women's section. Who the F did I see? Or what was it? The fact this happened at Walmart of all places is weird in itself, but it really did freak me out. Edit. I know people are gonna think, "Oh, you just saw someone who looked like your girlfriend." But she was wearing something very specific. A Disneyland jersey, which you get only from the park with Disney Crocs. We live in a retirement town near a res in the valley, so not many 5'9" blonde girls decked out in Disney here. Plus, the girl I saw disappeared basically into thin air, so even if it was a girl who looked like my girlfriend, still was weird. Nothing else really makes sense. Let me explain. My family would go camping every chance we got. The place we'd always go had no natural predators, at least nothing bigger than a fox. My dad specifically chose this spot so us kids, me and my 2 siblings, could frolic through the woods without having to worry. This particular trip was during the May-long weekend. There was still a considerable amount of snow, so my dad brought our ATVs and some sleds for us. It was the day after we had arrived, and my dad wanted to go on a little trip down the road we came up. I asked if I could come, and he said sure. We both hopped on his quad and set out on our little trip. I forgot to mention earlier that we had deer around the area. Nothing crazy, but the odd one would wander through our campsite. You could tell they had no natural predators, since they didn't run away when there was a human around. My siblings and I would always manage to get pretty close to one before my parents yelled at us to stay away. That is... Anyway, my dad and I were a few miles from the campsite when we rounded a corner and came across one of the most gruesome sights I have ever seen in my life. On the side of the road were the pieces of a deer. At least I think it was one. There was blood absolutely everywhere. Worst still, there was steam coming from the remains, which meant this was a recent kill. My dad is usually a pretty calm guy. Not much can rattle him, but I could tell that this freaked him the hell out. He was in the process of turning us around when this, I don't know, screech came from the forest. It was so loud we both flinched. I remember searching the forest for the source, but my dad was in the process of hauling ass down the way we came. It could have been a trick of the light, or because I was freaked out and maybe I was seeing things. But I could have sworn I saw something running alongside us, but only for a second or two. I know I sound absolutely crazy, but the thing looked like a large dog before it vanished into the trees. My dad raced back to camp, and we were all packed up and headed to a different location by the end of the day. We never did go back to that campsite after this encounter. I did ask my dad about it a couple years ago. He just said it was because the new campsite was better than the old, better trails and whatnot. I think he's full of crap. I think whatever we encountered that day scared the hell out of him. And I think that whatever I saw, he did too. But I, for one, am thankful we never went back. I'm not sure if I would be able to sleep at night after what I saw. It still haunts me till this day. In the spring of 2009, I was driving through central Wisconsin from Minneapolis to my home in northern Michigan on Highway 64 between Gilman and Medford. I had been seeing deer on the road since St. Croix, so I was driving slowly and on high alert. At the farthest reach of my high beams, I saw something walking across the road. I slowed way down to about 30 miles per hour, and that's when I saw it. Now here is the weird part. I saw the back of it as it was jumping over the steel barrier. It was bipedal, had legs that resembled a moose and ears like a dog, but no tail. It had to have been 7-8 feet tall. I think I almost swallowed my tongue. I came to a T in the road about a half hour later. Right at the T, there was a bar. It was open, and I needed a drink. Just a shot. I was driving after all. I must have had a wild look on my face because I just sat down at the end of the bar and asked for a shot of anything. When the bartender poured me a shot of JD, he said, "You just saw it, didn't you?" I didn't say a word. I just looked at him. He said, "This one is on the house." I drank the damn shot, put $5 on the bar, and left. I never mentioned it to anyone else until now. Hello? I've been taking walks on the park 20 kilometers away from my home. It's surrounded by mountains, and a very wide walking trail is in the middle, with also a road for cars. I take my runs there sometimes, and a few weeks ago, I saw a bald man with a very interesting face. Blue-drawn eyes, around 55, 60 years old, black coat, and a very correct walk like he's some aristocrat or something. He seemed a very interesting dude, but I paid no more attention and forgot it. 1 week later, I took a walk with my girlfriend, and I see this man coming in our path. We cross paths, and he says, "Good afternoon." I say it back and continue. My girlfriend also stated that he looks creepy, and I told her he's probably just being polite. Note, in my country, no one says hello without knowing you, so it was kinda odd. Now we've been joking about what if this guy turns out to be something non-human and all that, but I really didn't think much of it. This week, I took a walk at night with my girlfriend, and we were walking besides the main trail in a higher trail, like 5 meters away, and I see him walking down an opposite path. And out of nowhere, he's staring at me and starts coming up. I tell my girl, "Look, it's that guy," and she freaks out. I kinda do too. We continue walking and we turn our back, but he hasn't climbed. We go down to the main trail and see he's still walking his way, and we continue our walk, then go home. Just the other night, I had a thought about that guy climbing his way out to us in the walking park, and it turned to reality. Now, I don't expect people to know what exactly is the thing with this guy, but just wanted to talk about it. Maybe we are judging him and nothing is wrong with him, but his face is just so odd, and his energy too. It's not that I felt threatened by it, but just creeped. We were walking around Dawn's elk ranch. Then, all of a sudden, all of the elk started running around frantically. Me and my friend thought it was a cougar or something. We sat there for 20 minutes at least. Every one of the elk were looking back at where they came from, which I thought was really weird. Then, all of a sudden, I swear to God, I saw it. I swear to God, Bigfoot, it was a hairy ape, man-looking thing. It was about 8 to 8, 6 foot tall, very muscular, and walked on its hind legs. It was walking in a fast pace, like it needed to be somewhere in a hurry. I grabbed my shotgun and shot 2 in the air. It ran straight for the brush, and we never seen it again. The smell of the thing smelled like Hanase garbage and shit mixed together. When I fired the first shot, it picked up a big rock and flung it at us. Too bad we were 100 yards away. He came pretty close to hitting us. That's when I laid down the law. I piped another shell and laid it right on him. That's when he took off. That's then last I seen of him or her. My neighbor's friend, who lives far, far up Rocky Point Road, came over to my neighbor's house the other day, all shooken up. My neighbor's son was the one that told me this story. Apparently, my neighbor's friend was driving down Rocky Point Road sometime that morning. I got the impression that it was early in the morning, and a ape-like person, only 4 or 5 feet tall, ran across the road. I'm guessing on 2 feet, and then grabbed the top of the bank on one side of the road and pulled the rest of its body up and swung his legs under his arms and pushed itself into a run, and it ran off into the woods. I didn't get a very good description of what he thought it looked like, except that it was about 4 or 5 feet tall and had long arms. My neighbor told me that a few other people who live up there have seen the exact same thing. My neighbor, I'm not sure how long ago, also saw this thing which he described was around 4 feet tall and had a net-like, from the movie, monkey face, with long arms and short legs. I think he might have said it was black or brownish, but I'm not sure. He saw it about 500 feet from where his friend saw it. I am planning on going up there with a friend or two and just hanging out with a camera in hopes of catching evidence of it, or just finding out what it is. I think this is something definitely worthy of a small investigation, even though it doesn't sound like the normal 8-10 foot tall Bigfoot sighting. You should talk to my neighbor on the phone at least and get some other people's numbers who might have more information. I spent a small part of my military career at the Harvey Point Defense Testing Facility in North Carolina. Most people know that the base is completely shrouded in CIA mystery. The rumors and conspiracy theories about Harvey Point run strong and plenty. The facility is hidden away behind large fences and large trees. It's a fascinating place with a fascinating history, but I do hope that I never set foot there again. It's a fairly large facility, and most of the people there like to make friends, as is normal amongst humans. While I was there, I heard many people talking about an animal of some kind that would appear occasionally at night and scare one of the personnel. I was always one of the people who was just too busy to stop and chat, so I never really joined in the conversations. I always just heard it in passing. From what I could gather, though, the animal was terrifying. It had scared some personnel so badly that they needed counseling. I just figured it was a large dog or a bear or something. Anyway, it seemed to be a rather hushed topic of discussion. I had heard many people talk about other people having seen it, but I had never heard anyone actually say that they had seen it, so I brushed it off most of the time. I never really thought anything of it. I was always too busy to pay attention, and I didn't care much for spooky campfire stories. That is, until I discovered that it was nothing at all like a spooky campfire story. I was walking through the base one night, taking some paperwork with me. For the life of me, I can't remember exactly where I was going, but I know that I was walking with determination. I had my head down and I was looking at the papers when I walked directly into something. I remember noticing at first that it felt like human skin, as if I had walked into someone who was completely naked, only this thing was completely cold. Keep in mind, all of this happened within a matter of seconds. I looked up, and staring at me is what looks similar to what I imagine a shaved bear looks like. Only the skin was pale, and it was about 3 times the size of a large bear. It was scrawny, and it breathed heavily. I was completely frozen in place. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I call for help? I knew for sure that attacking wasn't an option. The large claws on that creature told me that it could kill me with one hit. So I just stared, unable to breathe from fear. The creature just huffed and scampered off into the darkness, leaving me there in a state of pure panic. The sweat was running down my back when I finally caught my breath, but with every second that I stood outside, I felt more and more unsafe. So I turned and went back to bed, forgetting all about the paperwork in my hands. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I just thought about whether or not I should tell someone what I had seen. But then I remembered the way that other people spoke about those who had come into contact with the creature, and all of it had been negative. Those people had been called weak, crazy, unstable, unable to serve. I didn't want that for myself. So I decided that I would just rather keep quiet and never walk through the base at night again. The thing that scared me most about it was that I found myself constantly wondering how it got inside the facility, or if it was rather trapped in there with no way out. I had been a park ranger for years, and I thought I had seen it all. But one night, deep in the heart of the forest, I encountered something that shook me to my core. I was on my nightly patrol, checking on the park's inhabitants and making sure everything was running smoothly. That's when I saw it, a dark figure lurking in the shadows, with 2 glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. As I got closer, I realized it was a Bigfoot, but not like any I had ever seen before. It was taller than any man I had ever seen, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung down past its knees. Its fur was a deep, dark brown, almost black, and it seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. But it was the eyes that really caught my attention. They were a bright, glowing green, and they seemed to look right through me. I froze, unsure of what to do next. The creature let out a low growl, and I could feel the vibrations of its voice in my chest. I took a step back, but it didn't seem to be aggressive. It just stood there, staring at me with those eerie, glowing eyes. After a few moments, the Bigfoot turned and vanished into the forest, leaving me alone in the dark. I reported the sighting to my superiors, but they didn't believe me. They said it was just my imagination, or that I had seen a bear or a trick of the light. But I knew what I had seen. That Bigfoot was real, and it was out there lurking in the shadows of the forest. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting for its chance to reveal itself once again. Every night, I hear what sounds like someone talking through a very muffled megaphone outside my window. It's always far away, but just enough to still hear it. The voice changes like someone is flipping to another channel on a TV. Every night that I go out with my family around our neighborhood for walks or car rides, I never hear it. The strangest part about it, though, is that it's sound high up in the air, and it starts from what sounds like one side of the neighborhood to the other. I don't know how it's able to get from one side to the other that fast, because my neighborhood is extremely large and has small roads that aren't very direct. The noise always happens between 9 and 11 p.m. at night. I asked a bunch of people in my neighborhood if they heard it too, to which they said no. There are apparently no events in the neighborhood or nearby, because I checked with the HOA and even went to town hall and asked about it. But again, they said that there couldn't be any events like that. I wouldn't be suspicious of that fact, if not for nobody else in the neighborhood hearing it. I don't know what the noise is, or who or what it comes from, but I just want it to stop. It has affected my mental health and sleep schedule, and I just want it gone. This story happened to a friend of mine. I share it here with his permission. My friend described what he experienced as follows. Year 1986. There were no electricity or road in the village. The villagers had to go to Elazig, a city of Turkey, to meet their needs. The road to the center was 2-3 kilometers from the village. It was necessary to be on this road at 4:30 a.m. to reach Elazig. There was only one car that goes to Elazig. The car was coming back like noon. The road used to go to Elazig was called Kinderisi, Demon Creek, by the villagers, and they thought that strange events were happening there and that it wasn't auspicious. Me and 2 of my friends started preparing at 3 p.m. to hit the road. The road we had to cross that included the Demon Creeks to reach Elazig was on our minds. First, we planned to cross the Ridgeway, then the Demon Creek, and enter the highway that leads to Elazig. Afterwards, we hit the road. We lighted our cigarettes while being in a deep conversation. It was utter darkness. There wasn't even moonlight. We were slowly encouraging ourselves to cross the Demon Creek and thinking about that moment. We were getting close to the Demon Creek, but first we had to cross the Ridgeway. The path was so narrow that 2 people could not walk side by side, and it was filled with big bushes. We were moving in a single line. I was the last one in the row. The first guy in the row, named Kamal, suddenly stopped, and he mentioned that there was a black dog watched us without moving on the way. I thought to myself, it's one of our village dogs. My friends were very nervous. We were getting more scared of the stories that we had heard since our childhood. I was scared and started reciting Bismillah. It's a Muslim prayer. The dog suddenly got out of the way and disappeared after moving a few meters away in the bushes. After the dog had disappeared, we thought to ourselves what the dog was doing there and continued to walk. After walking for 1 to 2 minutes, Kamal suddenly stopped again and yelled, "It's the same dog again, Hassan," before moving a few steps back. 3 of us didn't know what to do because of confusion and fear. The dog was looking at us again. I recited Bismillah again. The dog stood up and vanished again at the bushes, my friend said. "Hey, Shan, let's go back and don't go there." And I said, "We need to cross this road. If we don't, we will have to tomorrow. We will use this road for shopping." And calmed them down. Then we continued to our path. My friends were scared. Of course do I. We were talking about why did the dog appear at us again. I tried to calm them down by saying, it's just a common dog and following us. We continued to our path. We couldn't believe our eyes what we had seen after 3-5 minutes. A coal-black goat was standing on the road like blocking the way. We were so scared. We started to pray and recite Bismillah. The goat suddenly disappeared. Disappearing of the goat made me comprehend that these events weren't ordinary at all, and we got scared seriously, but going back was unnecessary. I calmed my nerves and went to the first row of the line, and I backed my friends. I was both praying and continuing our route. It is only a sharp corner left for Demon Creek. We were shocked when we finished crossing the sharp corner. What we had seen was indescribable. Long, white as snow, shining silhouette, shape, mass, whatever. It was obvious that it had arms and legs, but its face was ambiguous, and so it started to create sounds of rumble, scream, crying. We closed our ears with our hands. We were throwing ourselves out of fear and flapping on the ground. In the same time, it was blindly shining. I started to recite my known prayers. My friends were yelling, cursing, and they didn't know what they were doing. I was thinking about how to escape this situation and staying calm. I dragged my friends out of that incident. The screaming voices turned into laughter while we were escaping from there. The laughter echoed in our minds. We head back to the village, but we didn't know how we could come back. At the entrance of the village, there was the house of Kamal. When Kamal's parents saw us, they couldn't believe their eyes. They said, "What's the matter with you? You have paleness in your face." We couldn't speak, trembling continuously, make noises like dummies. They informed our relatives. They also came here. They tried to grasp with the mind the situation. I rested for a while and drank some water and told them the story. The villagers were stunned. They told us to thank God that you could come in one piece. We thought that we saved ourselves, but from sunrise to sunset for 40 days, we had heavy headaches, skin rash, huge herpes in our lips. I grew up around Point Pleasant. As a kid, the Mothman was ubiquitous. Everyone had a story. Relatives, neighbors, friends, brothers, roommates, you get the idea. Just hearing about it always gave me the chills. My parents divorced when I was young, and me and my mom eventually moved out of Point Pleasant. I was an only child, and I'd spent summers with my dad. I loved them, but I didn't feel like I was that connected with them back then. He used to take me camping a lot. He was an outdoorsman, and he loved introducing me to the beauty of nature. It was okay, but honestly, I would have rather watched movies or played video games. During one of our trips, I wandered from our site to gather wood for a fire. The sun had already gone down, and it was getting pretty dark. I wandered a bit too far, and as I looked around, I didn't see my dad or our Tid. That's when I heard this strange clicking sound coming from up in the trees. I looked up and froze. Dropping the sticks in my hands, the shadowy figure was perched high in the branches, maybe about 20 feet up. 2 glowing red eyes pierced the darkness, staring right at me. They were big and round, and I remember being held under their spell, like I was hypnotized or something. I was convinced it was the Mothman. The branches creaked as the creature stood up and spread its massive wings. It swooped down from the tree, shrieking. I ducked and covered my eyes and felt this gust of wind as it skimmed over me. I stayed curled up in a ball, screaming, until I felt my dad pick me up and hug me. Said it was the Mothman as I sobbed uncontrollably. He calmed me down, and we walked back to our tent, where he cooked us dinner of hot dogs and canned beans. We ate in silence, and he could tell that I was still bothered by the experience. We heard an owl in the trees, and he said a lot of times owls are mistaken for the Mothman. He took out a flashlight and shined it around the trees, trying to find the owl. Sure enough, he caught it, and its eyes reflected this orange-red glow. The owl flew off after being identified, but I was sure the creature I saw was much bigger. I asked them what the Mothman was. He thought for a moment, then he said it was a force of nature that we just don't understand. But it shouldn't be feared. Instead, it should be revered and respected. I never heard of the Mothman described that way, and I asked him if he ever saw it himself. He paused thoughtfully, smiled, and shook his head no. Normally, after dinner, we'd stargaze, and my dad would point out the constellations. But I just went into the tent and tried to go to sleep. That night, I had a horrible dream with a vivid imagery of fire, broken glass, and twisted metal. At the time, I had no idea what it meant, but it was so real. I woke up screaming. Once again, my dad had to calm me down when I told him about my dream. He gave me a strange look. We weren't scheduled to leave until the following afternoon, but I was so unnerved I begged him to go home early. My dad was a good sport and didn't complain. As we packed up our stuff, I felt guilty and apologized for ruining the trip. He reassured me that everything would be okay. and that we'd make up for it with the movie night. As soon as we got onto Route 62, I felt much better. The next day we were watching TV in the afternoon, and a breaking news story interrupted the program. Apparently, there was a major pileup on Route 62 after a big rig overturned. Several cars were involved, and there were fatalities. It stopped traffic in both directions for hours. My dad commented that it happened on the same route that we took home. If we stuck to our schedule and left the campground when we were originally supposed to, we very well could have been involved in that accident. They continued watching the news in silence, before finally turning to me and admitting that he did see the Mothman once when he was in high school. At least he thought he did. He and some friends were driving along Route 62 one night. They were drag racing. He knew it was a stupid thing to do, but they were just teenagers. Suddenly, a winged creature started following them. No matter how fast they drove, it easily kept up. He said it was dark and that he couldn't make out its features, but he never forgot its large glowing eyes. He and his friends slowed down and the creature disappeared. That night, he had a dream exactly like the one I had. He thought it was a warning and vowed never to race again. Unfortunately, his friend died in a car wreck a few weeks later while drag racing. One of the things that you hear about the Mothman is that he brings doom, like the infamous Silver Bridge collapse in 1967. That more or less introduced him, while some blamed him for that event and other tragedies over the years. My dad believed that the Mothman was just an omen. How you interpret it is entirely up to you. I know some will say he's evil personified, a servant of the devil or something like that. I don't think he's good or evil. He just is. He doesn't pick sides. But if you see him, set aside your fear and pay attention to what he's trying to tell you. I don't know what I actually saw that night in the forest. It was dark, and my overactive kid imagination immediately saw a monster. But like my dad said and even proved, it could have been an owl. I can't help but think that the signing in my dreams were the Mothman trying to warn me. Just like he warned my dad, I wondered how many other people he appeared to, and how many of them listened. The relationship between me and my dad changed that summer. We became closer. I guess sharing bizarre experiences will do that. I haven't seen the Mothman since, but I haven't been afraid either. My dad is old now, and we don't go camping like we used to. But I cherish every moment with him. In some way, the Mothman taught me that life is fleeting and never take it for granted. The first encounter with whatever this thing is was when I was running on a trail in the woods behind my elementary school. I got halfway through when I heard a UFO-esque warble. Something I've never heard before. I looked up in the tree I heard it come from and saw something that looked like a mix between what could have been a monkey and a bird. It had the body of a monkey or some mammal, 4 limbs and brown fur, and the head of a bird-shaped head with beak and feathers. Also, after I spotted it, and it ran off quickly for the rest of the time I was on the trail, stuff kept falling around me, like branches and acorns. And this didn't happen until I spotted it. I thought I was hallucinating after encountering it, but later that month I was on a different trail behind my high school this time, when I encountered it again. I was going through the trail when I started to hear wolves howling, which is weird because wolves don't live in my area to my knowledge. At that point, I started to pick up the pace because I don't want to be eaten. Eventually, I hear S moving in the trees, and at one point I spot the damn bird monkey again. After that, the howling got closer and stuff started to fall around me again. I'm usually calm, but I started to get a little nervous. Eventually, I get to the end of the trail, and that's when I hear what sounds like a dog whimpering in a nearby bush. Crap still dropping around me, and the howling is getting closer, but I stopped because it could be a dog in distress. I eventually left it without checking, though, because with everything going on, it probably wasn't a dog. I don't know if the howling and dog were connected, but I added it anyway, as it all happened in the same encounter. I have no clue what bird monkey thing it is or its name, but any help would be appreciated. I will add that the woods behind my high school and elementary school are very haunted. I've done a ton of ghost hunting at night. I can always put my other ghost cryptid stories up if wanted. I've been a park ranger for over a decade, and in that time, I've seen some incredible things. But nothing could have prepared me for the truth about what was really happening in the national park where I worked. It all started when I noticed that there had been an unusually high number of disappearances in the park. Hikers, campers, and even other park rangers had vanished without a trace, and despite our best efforts, we couldn't find any clues as to what had happened to them. That's when I started to notice something strange. My supervisor and some of my colleagues seemed to be hiding something from me. They would speak in hushed tones when I was around, and I could sense that they were holding back information from me. Finally, I confronted my supervisor, demanding to know what was really going on in the park. That's when he revealed the truth. There were unknown predators in the park, creatures that were preying on hikers and campers and even other park rangers. I was shocked and horrified by this revelation, but what really terrified me was the fact that my colleagues had been keeping this information from me. How long had they known about these creatures? And why hadn't they done more to warn people or protect them from harm? I knew that I couldn't keep this information to myself. I went to the media and shared the truth about what was really happening in the park. But instead of being praised for my bravery, I was fired from my job as a park ranger. Now I'm on the run, pursued by the very people I used to work alongside. But I won't stop until the truth about the unknown predators in the park is exposed. I know that it's dangerous and that these creatures could come after me at any moment. But I won't rest until justice is served and the innocent people who have vanished in the park are given the answers they deserve. In 1981, my friends lived in a very rural cabin near Baxter State Park, Maine. The road was only traveled by the residents. You could drive on it and not expect to see any other cars. I was driving up there one night. As I went around the last bend before reaching the cabin, an 8-foot-tall Sasquatch was standing on the side of the road. It was massive. It had to be 4 feet across the shoulders with brownish blonde hair. I then noticed that it was a male. His skin was dark. The face had a long beard and looked both ape-like and human-like. He stood there motionless, looking at me. I was freaked out when my headlights were on him and we actually made contact. He was not 20 feet from me. I sped past and then into my friend's driveway. I ran into the cabin screaming that I'd seen a huge Sasquatch. A few years later, I bought a small property near Mount Blue State Park, Maine. One winter, a friend was visiting from Utah. My boyfriend and his friends went out on the snowmobiles at night. Later, we were inside the cabin and started hearing these bizarre growls like no noise I'd ever heard before or since. The growls got louder and louder, and then whatever this was started screaming, literally shaking the cabin. It was right outside. I ran toward the door and placed a board barricade through the loop. As soon as I did, that something was pulling and shaking the door on the other side. Each time we changed our position in the cabin, that part of the cabin would be attacked. We were terrified. My boyfriend had brought a pistol, so I grabbed it. We climbed the ladder to the bedroom. Whatever that thing was landed on the roof above us, its screams were the scariest things you have ever heard, and they're impossible to repeat. Just as we thought our lives were over, we could hear the snowmobiles coming back. Whatever that thing was finally ran off. We told the guys what had happened, and they went out to look for tracks. At first, they thought we were crazy until they saw huge unknown prints with long claw marks in the snow. There were deep scratches on the window frames and outside walls. My boyfriend was an experienced hunter. He couldn't explain the prints or the deep claw marks. I soon moved out west to California. There is no way I was staying in that cabin, let alone in Maine. I just got back from a week-long trip to Florida. My fiancée and I were visiting her parents, who own a home in Boca Raton, and I was hoping to get a fishing trip in with her father Jim while I was there. The Everglades aren't too far from where they live, and her dad owned a small boat. And since he's retired, he spends a good deal of time taking it out on some of the local lakes. I ran the idea of fishing the glades past him, and he seemed to be just as excited as me. Despite being in the vicinity, he had actually never fished it. Well, a few days after we got there, we made arrangements and set out early in the morning, towing his boat behind us. It wasn't one of the boats from the movies, you know, with the big fans. It was a nice little 14-foot tracker, which was perfect for the narrow waterways. We're both kind of anti-technology YouTube videos, and computer solitaire is the extent of our interest. Select fools, neither one of us brought a satellite GPS, and we both left our phones in the truck. Anyway, we got to the glades and got the boat in the water around 9. We planned to fish around 2 and then head back home and be there in time for dinner. We hadn't planned on getting lost. It was a blast at first. We saw a few alligators, which I'd never seen in the wild. We stopped to fish a few times and even caught a few largemouths each. I guess around 1 p.m. when we figured we should start heading back in the direction we came. We were both adept at navigation and kept aware of when and where we had turned, but it didn't really help. We had seriously underestimated the labyrinth of channels and canals, and it didn't take us long to realize that we'd gotten lost in the maze of the Everglades. We weren't panicking yet. But by this time it was well past 2 p.m., and we couldn't tell if we'd made any progress or not. We had just come around the turn of yet another channel when I saw something bizarre. Something that had been standing along one of the banks dove into the water just as we made the turn. I only caught a glimpse of it, but it had been standing upright on 2 legs and had a green, scaly complexion. I convinced myself that it was just an alligator and maybe the sun had caught it at a weird angle. Besides, we had bigger problems. The sun was getting low in the sky, and we hadn't seen a single other person. We didn't have much water, and we were still completely lost. I really regret thinking I was macho enough to not need a GPS. A few canals later, I happened to turn around and caught sight of something in the water right behind the boat. It looked like an alligator, but it was moving way too fast, and it was speeding directly towards me. I was in the back on the motor, and I gunned the throttle in surprised response. A bunch of things happened at once. Not expecting the sudden shift in speed, my soon-to-be father-in-law fell back against the side of the boat and tumbled into the water. At the same time, the creature that had been tailing us rose out of the water and lashed out toward me with a set of razor-sharp claws. When I say rose, I mean stood up on 2 legs like a human would. Gunning the engine is probably what saved me, as the swipe fell short. I burst forward a few feet and got a good look at this thing. The water was around 5 feet deep there, and this thing was standing up the waterline around its waist. It had a pair of thickly muscled arms, each sporting one of those clawed fists that had almost decapitated me. Greenish-black scales ran the length of it and then terminated in a flat head, jaw open, bearing 2 rows of serrated teeth. I saw Jim hit the water and immediately start splashing around. I knew he could swim, but being launched from a boat into alligator-infested waters is probably the kind of thing to cause you to panic. The only problem was that this thing was between me and Jim. I couldn't leave him, and I couldn't get around this thing. There was no room. I'm not saying I'm brave, because I certainly didn't feel courageous in the moment. But I turned the boat around quickly, twisted the throttle as far as I could, and charged. The bow of the boat lifted into the air. I couldn't see past it, but I felt an impact, and the boat shuddered, almost tipping to the left. I let go of the throttle and pulled alongside the frantic Jim and grabbed his arm. I started hauling him in and looked back over my shoulder. The wake from the short burst was lapping against both sides of the channel, and thick rings of water flowing away from where I guessed the creature had been. It was nowhere in sight. I brought Jim into the boat and, not too gently, threw him to the deck, plopped back down next to the motor, and sped away up the channel. We didn't see the creature again. After a few hours, we eventually ran into a group of guys who led us back to the boat ramp. We were only about 20 minutes away and had pretty much been going in circles the whole time. We each had about a dozen missed calls from our wives. I think Jim was pretty upset with me, but eventually he came around and laughed it off. He had never actually seen the thing and thought I had just overreacted to an alligator, but I know that it wasn't. Alligators don't stand on 2 feet, and they don't attack with their claws. I don't know if it's a species of animal that hasn't been encountered yet or a weird human-alligator hybrid, but whatever it is, it probably shouldn't exist. Good afternoon. I am an Orthodox priest from Russia. In 2021, in the Crimea in the mountains above Yalta, I personally saw Bigfoot. It was attracted by the sound of the whistle on which I played in the Ukash track. Bigfoot went out to a rock located opposite the west of me. I was on the east side of the gorge. There were about 300 meters between us. It looked tall, strikingly taller than a man, massive body and shoulders, long arms and long legs. While I took out the camera to photograph him, he went up the slope with huge steps of about 2 meters approximately. When I photographed the place where he was, all the pictures were overexposed, and my Canon EOS 5D Mark II let me down for the first time. Such is the short story of my second and such a bright meeting with Bigfoot. Earlier this year in March, I was in my work van driving from Warninglide to Littlehampton, West Sussex, to start my deliveries. It was early morning around 5, still pitch black, but weather was clear. I was driving southbound on the A24 and had just passed the southern tip of the village of Ashington, soon to be approaching the Storrington roundabout. On my left-hand side, there is a section of grass that runs for a few hundred feet and is about 6 feet wide or so before it becomes a huge thicket of brambles. I saw a creature that I can only describe as cardboard box color. It was about 4 feet tall, but down on its haunches to where its heels were touching its butt. It was facing diagonally away from me into the base of the bushes, so I saw its back and left side of its body more so than anything else. Its spine was showing, and also ribs, but not to the extreme, and it had small round ears that were in the location of a human's, but shaped in a similar way as to what a black bear's are. It had a tail that rose up into a subtle S shape, was very skinny and seemed to be hairless like the rest of the animal. The face, from what I could see, had a muzzle, but not extremely pronounced, and it seemed to be tracking something in the grass. My guess would be some kind of rodent. Its head movements were very digital and all over the place, and it jumped like how a fox would when pouncing, but in doing so, I saw the soles of the feet, which I remember extremely clearly, as they looked like ours. But given the hours that I'm awake, and the fact I'm a proper country boy, I see multiple foxes on a daily. This was as far from a fox as a monkey is. It was nothing I had ever seen before in person, on telly, internet, or in books. The duration lasted about 5 seconds, and as soon as I saw it, I had shivers all over my body, and I literally said out loud, "What the F was that?" I couldn't believe my eyes. I got to the roundabout probably 30 seconds later and doubled back on myself to get back into the same road again in hopes I could get a second glimpse, but I wasn't lucky. The thing about it all that was almost stranger than the sighting itself was that I had such a strong feeling of shame that came over me. I felt so shameful in seeing it and have no idea why. I remember being in tears because of it, and I don't fully understand why, but I felt like I had no business seeing it, and if I had a regular job that never required me to be up so early, then I never would have. Still, no idea what it was. If anyone has seen anything similar, please share, or has any insight, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. My infant daughter and I had driven up north from Kamloops, British Columbia, for the day to visit my mother. We had gone out to dinner, and my baby girl fell asleep in the middle. We put her in the carrier and covered her with a new pink blanket. When dinner was over, we said our goodbyes. Away we went. It was about 10 p.m. by the time we got on the road, and we had a good 2-hour drive ahead. I was glad that the next day was a Sunday, and I would be able to catch up on some sleep. I played music quietly to keep me alert, and it worked for the first hour and a half of my drive, but at about 11:30 p.m., something else happened that made me more alert than I've ever been in my entire life. It was very dark, and the lights along this rural road were spaced out pretty far, so my headlights were the only lights I could rely on. But as I turned along a slow curve, I saw something ahead. On the right side of the road was a creek, and in order to make sure there were no incidents with people driving into the gully, a guardrail was in place. It had cement blocks attached every so often that held the lights in place. As my high beam stretched brightly into the darkness, I saw something on the cement block up ahead. I squinted to make out the dark silhouette. Just then, the figure leaped from the cement block and flew through the air. It landed solidly on the road directly in my path. I watched as it slowly began to stand up tall and raise its arms over its head. I saw the muscular thing stretch until it had shown its full height. About 2.5 meters tall, its furry arms were wide. They waved wildly in the air, and as I approached my car, I could see its muscular build. At first, when it was still on the side of the road, I thought it was a black bear trying to hunt, since deer are prevalent in this area. But as it stood there, I could see the human-like qualities of its limbs and face. It looked like a giant. A very hairy, ugly, naked man. Then it did something completely unexpected. It crouched down, and I thought it was going to jump back into the forest that surrounded us. But instead, it laid down, stretching its full body across the lane. It was too late for me to stop or swerve. I hit him, or whatever it was. I hit it with my Honda Accord. I had expected there to be a huge crunching sound, and my thoughts immediately went to my sleeping baby. Would we get hurt? Would our car be drivable? I didn't want us to be stranded, but to my surprise, we rolled over it pretty easily. There was a thumping sensation, and I knew that the position of my car had made me run over its head. I felt sick, thinking I could have killed someone or some poor creature, but the image of it standing in the road made me uneasy enough to assault my guilt. I stopped the car for a moment. When we had gone about 100 meters or so, I looked in my rearview mirror to see it laying there still, illuminated by my brake lights. It wasn't moving. Panic, fear, and concern flooded me in a mix of waves of emotion. I thought about getting out of the car, but I worried that maybe it was still alive and angry. I couldn't risk getting hurt, not with my baby in the car. That's when I made the decision that still haunts me. I floored the accelerator, and I didn't stop until I got home. When we finally pulled into my driveway, I felt safe. I immediately grabbed the carrier with my baby, and I went inside. After putting her into her crib, I paced the house. The rest of my family was out of town, and unreachable by phone. I had no idea what to do. After worrying and pacing, I finally decided to call the provincial police. I knew that no one would take my call seriously if I said it was a Sasquatch. After the call, I went out to check the damage to the car. I feared the worst. I really thought that I would have to explain the unexplainable to the mechanic. But the damage was minimal. Only the license plate was bent, and on one of the bolts, I had found hairs from the creature. I thought about keeping it, but reasoned that it was crazy and threw it out. No one would believe me. I called the police the next day to check and found that there was no record of my call, and nothing suspicious was reported along any of the country roads. When my family returned, I told them the story. Of course, they thought I was making it up. After a while, I stopped talking about it. My family still makes fun of me, but I've learned not to respond. But I know what really happened that night, and I know it's still out there. I used to work as a park ranger at a well-known, frequently visited national park. At this particular national park, there was an old ghost story that the veteran rangers used to tell about one of our number who heard a noise coming from a lake one day. The noise had apparently sounded like a puppy yelping and splashing, but the ranger who heard it couldn't swim and wasn't about to put himself in danger of drowning just to save a dog. The next day, the body of a young child washed up on the shore. It was never a dog out there. It was a child that had fallen in the lake after being out there exploring unsupervised. The ranger was devastated. His spirit crushed that his selfishness had resulted in the death of an innocent child. He was haunted by the thought, took to drinking, wore himself down, until one night, while sleeping in his cabin, he heard a familiar noise coming from the lake. It was the sound of a little boy crying out to be rescued. He ran to the lakeside, dived into the water, and struggled his way into the center of the body of water until he reached the site of the splashing. But there, he only saw the smiling, bloated corpse of that same little boy who dragged him beneath the lake and drowned him just as he had. That's the way the story went, and to be honest, I thought it was the biggest load of bull I'd ever heard in my life. I told the crusty old-timers that same thing, that I'd have to be of diminished capacity to believe a crock of bullcrap like that. But instead of laughing, or whatever, like, okay, maybe this guy isn't as dumb as we first thought, they got all pissy about it. They told me not to disrespect the angry spirits of the departed, but then it was my turn to laugh. I could tell the difference between them getting annoyed over me disrespecting the dead or whatever, and them getting annoyed over me just disrespecting their dumb stories. The following week, I found I'd had my shift pattern switched to nights. I confronted them about it. Told them I was not impressed that they were that immature as to switch my shifts up, but they insisted that it was only cover for a guy whose mom had taken ill and had been forced to drive back to his home state in order to care for her. I didn't believe a word of it, and I was just straight up angry at that point. Angry that a pair of grown-ass men would lie about something like, basically just to gaslight me. But I didn't want to show them how frustrated I was. I'd just take their crap on the chin, so to speak, and not give them the satisfaction. So, the first night I'm there in the lakeside cabin, I'm settling in to prepare for a long night of utter boredom, brewing coffee and playing dumb mobile games, when I hear something from outside the cabin. I put down my phone, get up, and walk over to the door to open it up so I can listen out for what it is. But I recognize it instantly. It's the sound of splashing, coupled with the sound of a child crying out for help between spluttered breaths. I remember shouting out into the darkness, "Think you can scare me with your dumb stories?" Well, I didn't believe them then, and I don't believe you now. Try it, someone with an IQ as low as yours. This was obviously their little game playing out, their attempt to scare me into submission and believing their backward-ass ghost story. But I wasn't about to let that happen. I went back inside, slamming the door shut and jamming my AirPods in on full volume to block the noise out. They were selfish, vindictive bastards. That's what I told myself anyway, but apparently not determined enough to keep playing that sound from whatever speaker system they'd set up around the cabin, because when I paused to buy music like 20 minutes later, the noise was gone and all was quiet again. The next morning, just after sunrise, I pack up my stuff and prepare to leave the cabin. I was so exhausted and irritated by the prank they pulled, I wasn't prepared to wait for them to arrive. I figured if I did, I'd be so angry at seeing them that I might have knocked some of their goddamn teeth out. That would get me fired, and I simply could not afford that, not with the economy in the state that it was. But as I'm walking to my truck, something catches my eye from the lakeside, something small and sodden that the gentle waves of the lake lapped against. I turned to look and saw what it was, and when I did, I dropped my bag in pure horror and disbelief at what I was staring at. It was the body of a child, face down in the dirt. I pulled out my phone, dialed 911, and basically screamed at the operator for an ambulance to get out to the place I was based at. They had to send a helicopter in the end, but before it showed up, the two crusty old rangers rolled up in their truck, and their G-damn eyeballs almost fell out of their head when they saw me trying to perform CPR on the dead kid. I tried, and I tried, and I tried, but he was gone. Long gone. And it was all my goddamn fault. I ended up vomiting about what had happened the night before, telling them everything, how I'd thought the whole thing was part of a prank, part of the punishment for not believing their goddamn story. They claimed to have no idea what I was talking about, which angered me even more. But when they asked me why I didn't help the kid, I flipped. I rushed one of the older guys, tackled him, and beat the living hell out of him before I was dragged off and talked me back down to earth. But I couldn't ever really calm down, not until the chopper arrived and put that kid's body on a stretcher. The paramedics seemed furious. There was no one to save. I remember one of them explicitly shouting over the din of the rotor blades that the kid's been dead for hours. When they took off and I drove back home to go on indefinite paid leave, I thought that might have been the end of it, and that I'd have the time and space to get over what had happened. But I didn't have time. Someone leaked information on what had happened. I don't know if it was the old-timer I decked, the other ranger, or the paramedics. But somehow, someone got a hold of my contact details, and the threatening calls began. I'll never forget the night my girlfriend answered the phone in our apartment, saying hello in that happy, chirpy way she always used to. I watched as her face went from all smiley to neutral to downright horrified. "Who is this? Hey, who the hell is this? Call here again, and I'm calling the cops." It was the first of many death threats, the first of many, many calls, handwritten letters and emails that told me I was an awful person, that I didn't deserve to live, that I was dead to the world the night I let that poor, innocent young boy drown in that lake. When his lungs filled with water and the death spasms racked body, he wasn't the only one to die. I died too. Needless to say, she wasn't my girlfriend for much longer, and I don't even blame her. There aren't many people who could handle that kind of abuse, and I only got through it myself by the skin of my teeth. And so that led me to where I am today. I live alone, in a state far, far away from the national park where I allowed a child to drown. I legally changed my name, changed my entire look so no one from my old life would be able to recognize me. I went through an intense period of transformation. The old me is a ghost as good as dead, dust in the wind, and no one will ever find me. No one. I am a Hiwi, a Native American, born and raised in a small village deep in the forest. I've always been at home in the woods, but I never imagined that one day I would be fighting for my life against an unknown creature. It happened on a dark and stormy night. I had been out hunting for food when I heard a strange noise. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I saw it, a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was large and hulking, with eyes that glowed in the darkness. It moved with an eerie grace, and I knew instinctively that it was not something I wanted to mess with. But before I could even think of what to do, the creature attacked me. It came at me with a fury, its claws slashing through the air. I fought back as best I could, using my bow and arrows to try and fend it off. But it was no use. The creature was too powerful, and it overpowered me easily. Just as I thought it was all over for me, the creature suddenly stopped attacking. It looked at me with its glowing eyes, and then it simply disappeared into the darkness. I was left lying on the forest floor, shaken and confused. What was that creature? And why had it attacked me? And why had it suddenly stopped just as it seemed like it was about to finish me off? For weeks after the attack, I searched the forest for any sign of the creature, but I found nothing. It was as if it had never existed in the first place. But I knew that I had not imagined it. The wounds on my body were proof enough that something had attacked me that night. Years passed, and I continued to live in the forest, always on the lookout for any sign of the creature that had nearly killed me. But it never appeared again, and I was left with nothing but my confusion and fear. To this day, I still wonder what that creature was, and why it had attacked me. Was it simply defending its territory, or was there something more sinister at play? I may never know the truth, but I will always remember that dark and stormy night, and the creature that left me shaken and confused. My two friends and I were deer and elk hunting. I'd been hunting alone for deer while my friends went after elk. At the end of the second day, we had decided to all hunt together and go after a small herd of elk that they had been pushing around. The general area consists of a large meadow, approximately 1.5 miles long times 3/4 miles wide. It is surrounded by mountains, approximately 500 feet higher than the meadow floor. We were to hunt the west end of the meadow and up into the mountains. Upon reaching our spot, we located the elk, feeding through a small field to the south and about halfway up. Friend 1 was going to head straight up and cut southeast through the field. Brandon and I headed southeast from the beginning, but stayed low. Upon reaching the east side of the field, we headed straight up and waited for Friend 1 to push the elk to us. Brandon set up about 100 yards above me on the trail. After about 20 minutes of waiting, I heard a call coming from the west side of the field. I assumed this was Friend 1 making his way to us. To me, it sounded like the type of call an animal makes when it is alarmed. This really bugged me. It was not the soft, reassuring cow call that I thought he should be making. The sound was very rhythmic. You could have played a tune to it. This was also very annoying. I thought, you are overcalling. Shut up already! Just about this time, Brandon lets out a couple of bugles, so I figured that he had Friend 1 in sight. The call came into the field and then abruptly turned south up the hill and then turned east again. It called the entire time. It would have gone almost exactly in between Brandon and myself, if it kept the same course. I was glassing the field, trying to see friend one, but I saw nothing. I know that I was looking directly at where the call was coming from, but there was nothing to see. This probably took about 10 to 15 minutes. Then the call stopped. I figured Brandon and friend one had met up on the trail, so I started to head down as it was getting pretty dark at this time. About 20 yards down, I heard a sound behind me. It was Brandon coming down. I stopped and waited. I asked him where friend one was. He said that he had not seen him, but that the elk were now on their way to the next county. Then I asked him if he had heard the call come across the field. He said no. I started to explain the sound when it started up again. Now it was across the trail to the east. It must have waited for Brandon to pass, then crossed. I shut up real quick so he could hear it, but it stopped again, then it started again. But this time it was quite a ways away. He thought he had heard it, but could not be sure. I jokingly said something about the stick Indians trying to lure us off in the woods. I have never heard a call like this in the woods before. Never. It was fairly low in tone, like an owl, but it had a real hollow sound to it. It reminded me of those blow-pop whistles that you had when you were a kid, only stressed or alarmed. That is the only way I can explain it. We started walking back to the truck. About halfway there we noticed that friend one was already there. We could see the interior lights on. We asked him how the push went and if he had seen the elk. He said no. Then I asked him if he had heard the call in the field. He said no, and that he hadn't even made it to the field before coming down. Brandon and I left it at that. It is important for me to stress that at no time did I feel in danger. Remember that for most of this time, I'm assuming that it is my friend messing up our evening hunt. A few days later, I called up Brandon and asked him if we could go back in there. I told him I thought there was a good chance of Bigfoot being in that area. He said that was funny because he had gone back in there to hunt those elk again and something strange happened to him. He was back in the field, only at the top this time. He was planning to cut it straight down the middle. As he started in, he heard a sound that he described as someone taking a baseball bat and smacking it as hard as possible against a tree. He thought it was a woodpecker at first, but it was too loud, and like the call, it was rhythmic and too slow for a woodpecker. Deer or elk antlers were out of the question. As he continued further into the field, it suddenly got faster. The sound was coming from some dense forest to the east of him. At this point, he stopped, turned and exited the field, choosing to hunt on a course that would take him back to his truck. On the way, he entered a smaller field which was covered with molehills. In one of these, he found a track. It was not much longer than his, but it was easily 3 or so inches wider. Brandon wears an 11. He got pictures and said that it would have been castable. He said it could have been a bear track, but was not entirely sure. He then went on to tell me that the elk we had pushed the other day had acted real strange. He didn't think much of it until now. When he had got above me on the trail, he saw the elk below headed down the field towards the place where friend one should have been. They suddenly stopped, did a 90 turn, and ran back up the hill. The elk had been calmly walking. This is when he tried calling to stop them. I've listened to the calls on your site. None of them match exactly. The Snohomish calls are very close, but this was deeper. Your calls are intermittent. The sounds I heard were as steady as a drumbeat. First, my friend Mike and I, along with 2 girls, were at the city park and heard it from Bellow from the hill behind us. 3 days later, we went back again, and this time I saw it. I thought it was a tall pole, but it looked to be wavering in the breeze that was blowing. I called Mike over to look, but it wasn't there. Then it caught my eye. We saw it walking up the hill where we had heard it earlier. My second sighting was at our family farm. 3 miles away from the first sighting. I and my friend Bill rode out to the farm that evening to check on things since nobody lived in the house there. As we turned into the driveway, the headlights swung, and there it stood, stepping over a 5-strand barbed wire fence. It had its hands on the top wire and was swinging its leg over. Its eyes glowed in the light like an animal's. We left in a hurry. I was target shooting. I had set up my targets and was just getting ready to begin my first string. A sudden, high-pitched warbling sound began nearby. I had my earmuffs on to protect my ears from the rifle blast, but lesser noises could still come through. When I first heard the noise, I thought it was an elk, but thought to myself that it was the wrong season for elk to be bugling. I turned in the direction of the sound and saw a large, hairy, erect humanoid figure standing on the other side of the road, about 80 feet away. I was immediately shocked at the sight, but I knew it meant me no harm. It could have easily slipped up behind me and wrung my neck before I even knew it was there. I couldn't understand why it just stood there looking at me. As I began to change my position, it called out again with a shorter and less intense squeal. I saw no exterior sexual organs, probably because I spent the entire time looking at the face, wondering what was going to happen. I think it was a male, though, because it acted male. I could easily be wrong. It stood there, looking at me for about 30 seconds, I think, before it turned and stepped into the brush. Afterwards, I had to let my nerves settle down for a while before I could even attempt to shoot. I kept looking at the spot. I had seen it and tried to estimate how big it had been. As nearly as I can figure or guess, it was about 7.5 feet tall, covered with long, dark brown hair except for a few white hairs across the shoulders, similar to gorillas and some older men. The arms seemed too long, extending almost to the knees. It made no noise as it entered the brush, passing through the foliage as quietly as if it were a ghost.